saluted and answered, "We are always prepared." It was we who had smuggled weapons into Buchenwald and joined the Communist Party there. And it was we who were now in disgrace, only because we had survived. Those prisoners who had been in Buchenwald and survived were in fact imprisoned for that very reason in our own camps. How could you have survived an annihilation camp? Something doesn't smell right. Back when the Red Army had cut through East Prussia, I had seen downcast columns of returning war prisoners, the only people around who were grieving instead of celebrating. Even then their gloom had shocked me, though I didn't yet grasp the reason for it. I jumped down and went over to those voluntarily formed-up columns. Why were they marching in columns? Why had they lined themselves up in ranks? After all, no one had compelled them to, and the war prisoners of all other nations went home as scattered individuals. But ours wanted to return as submissively as possible. I was wearing a captain's shoulder boards, and they, plus the fact that I was moving forward, helped prevent my finding out why our POWs were so sad. But then fate turned me around and sent me in the wake of those prisoners along the same path they had taken. I had already marched with them from Army Counterintelligence Headquarters to the headquarters at the front, and when we got there I had heard their first stories, which I didn't yet understand, and then Yuri Y. told me the whole thing. And here, beneath the domes of the brick-red Butyrki Castle, I felt that the story of these several million Russian prisoners had got me in its grip once and for all, like a pin through a specimen beetle. My own story of landing in prison seemed insignificant. I stopped regretting my torn-off shoulder boards. It was mere chance that had kept me from ending up exactly where these contemporaries of mine had ended. I came to understand that it was my duty to take upon my shoulders a share of their common burden, and to bear it to the last man until it crushed us. I now felt as if I, too, had fallen prisoner at the Soloviev crossing, in the Kharkov encirclement, in the quarries of Kerch, and hands behind my back had carried my Soviet pride behind the barbed wire of the concentration camps. That I, too, had stood for hours in the freezing cold for a ladle of cold kawa, an ersatz coffee, and had been left on the ground for dead without even reaching the kettle. That in Oflag 68, Suwalki, I had used my hands and the lid of a mess tin to dig a bell-shaped, upturned, that is, foxhole, so as not to have to spend the winter on the open field, and that a maddened prisoner had crawled up to me as I lay dying to gnaw on the still warm flesh beneath my arm, and with every new day of exacerbated, famished consciousness, lying in a barracks riddled with typhus, or at the barbed wire of the neighboring camp for English POWs, the clear thought had penetrated my dying brain. Soviet Russia has renounced her dying children. She had needed them, proud sons of Russia, as long as they let the tanks roll over them, and it was still possible to rouse them to attack, but to feed them once they were war prisoners. Extra mouths, and extra witnesses to humiliating defeats. Sometimes we try to lie, but our tongue will not allow us to. These people were labelled traitors, but a remarkable slip of the tongue occurred on the part of the judges, prosecutors, and interrogators. And the convicted prisoners, the entire nation, and the newspapers repeated and reinforced this mistake in voluntarily letting the truth out of the bag. They intended to declare them traitors to the motherland, but they were universally referred to in speech and in writing, even in the court documents, as traitors of the motherland. You said it. They were not traitors to her. They were her traitors. It was not they, the unfortunates, who had betrayed the motherland, but their calculating motherland who had betrayed them, and not just once, but thrice. The first time she betrayed them was on the battlefield, through ineptitude, when the government, so beloved by the motherland, did everything it could to lose the war, destroyed the lines of fortifications, set up the whole air force for annihilation, dismantled the tanks and artillery, removed the effective generals, and forbade the armies to resist. Now, after 27 years, the first honest work on this subject has appeared. P.G. Grigorenko, a letter to the magazine Problems of the History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Samizdat, 1968. and such works are going to multiply from here on out. Not all the witnesses died, and soon no one will call Stalin's government anything but a government of insanity and treason. And the war prisoners were the men whose bodies took the blow and stopped the Wehrmacht. The second time they were heartlessly betrayed by the motherland was when she abandoned them to die in captivity. And the third time they were unscrupulously betrayed was when, with motherly love, she coaxed them to return home with such phrases as, "The motherland has forgiven you. The motherland calls you," and snared them the moment they reached the frontiers. One of the biggest war criminals, Colonel General Golikov, former chief of the Red Army's intelligence administration, was put in charge of coaxing the repatriates home and swallowing them up. It would appear that during the 1,100 years of Russia's existence as a state, there have been, how many foul and terrible deeds, but among them, was there ever so multi-millioned foul a deed as this, to betray one's own soldiers and proclaim them traitors? How easily we left them out of our own accounting. He was a traitor. For shame, write him off. And our father wrote them off, even before we did. He threw the flower of Moscow's intelligentsia into the Vyazma meat grinder with Berdan single-loading rifles, vintage 1866, and only one for every 5 men at that. What Lev Tolstoy is going to describe that Borodino for us? And with one stupid slither of his greasy, stubby finger, the great strategist sent 120,000 of our young men, almost as many as all the Russian forces at Borodino, across the Strait of Kerch in December 1941, senselessly and exclusively for the sake of a sensational New Year's communique, and he turned them all over to the Germans without a fight. And yet, for some reason, it was not he who was the traitor, but they. How easily we let ourselves be taken in by partisan labels, how easily we agreed to regard these devoted men as traitors. In one of the Butyrki cells that spring, there was an old man, Lebedev, a metallurgist, a professor in rank, and in appearance a stalwart artisan of the last century, or maybe even the century before, from, say, the famous Demidov iron foundries. He was broad of shoulder, broad of head, wore a Pugachev-like beard, and the wide span of his hand could lift a 150-pound bucket. In the cell he wore a faded grey labourer's smock over his underwear. He was slovenly and might have been an auxiliary prison worker, until he sat down to read, and then his habitual powerful intelligence lit up his face. The men often gathered around him. He discussed metallurgy very little, but explained to us in his kettle-drum bass voice that Stalin was exactly the same kind of dog as Ivan the Terrible. Shoot, strangle, don't hesitate. He explained to us also that Maxim Gorky had been a slobbering prattler, an apologist for executioners. I was very much taken with this Lebedev. It was as though the whole Russian people were embodied there before my eyes, in that one thick-set torso with that intelligent head and the arms and legs of a ploughman. He had already thought through so much. I learned from him to understand the world. And suddenly, with a chopping gesture of his huge hand, he thundered out that those charged under Article 58(1)b were traitors of the motherland and must not be forgiven. And those very same 1Bs were piled up on the board bunks all around. And how hurtful to them this was. The old man was pontificating with such conviction in the name of Russia's peasantry and labour that they were abashed and found it hard to defend themselves against the attack from this new direction. I was the one to whom it fell, along with 2 boys charged under 5810, to defend them and to argue with the old man. But what depths of enforced ignorance were achieved by the monstrous lies of the state! Even the most broad-minded of us can embrace only that part of the truth into which our own snout has blundered. Witkowski writes about this on the basis of the 30s in more general terms. It was astonishing that the pseudo-wreckers, who knew perfectly well that they weren't wreckers, believed that military men and priests were being shaken up justifiably. The military men, who knew they hadn't worked for foreign intelligence services and had not sabotaged the Red Army, believed readily enough that the engineers were wreckers and that the priests deserved to be destroyed. In prison, the Soviet person reasoned in the following way: I personally am innocent, but any methods are justified in dealing with those others, the enemies. The lessons of interrogation and the cell failed to enlighten such people. Even after they themselves had been convicted, they retained the blind beliefs of their days in freedom, belief in universal conspiracies, poisonings, wreckings, espionage. How many wars Russia has been involved in? It would have been better if there had been fewer. And were there many traitors in all those wars? Had anyone observed that treason had become deeply rooted in the hearts of Russian soldiers? Then, under the most just social system in the world, came the most just war of all, and out of nowhere millions of traitors appeared, from among the simplest, lowliest elements of the population. How is this to be understood and explained? Capitalist England fought at our side against Hitler. Marx had eloquently described the poverty and suffering of the working class in that same England. Why was it that in this war only one traitor could be found among them, the businessman Lord Haw-Haw? But in our country, millions. It is frightening to open one's trap about this, but might the heart of the matter not be in the political system? One of our most ancient proverbs justifies the war prisoner. The captive will cry out, but the dead man never. During the reign of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, nobility was granted for durance in captivity, and in all subsequent wars it was considered society's duty to exchange prisoners, to comfort one's own and to give them sustenance and aid. Every escape from captivity was glorified as the height of heroism. Throughout World War I, money was collected in Russia to aid our prisoners of war, and our nurses were permitted to go to Germany to help our prisoners, and our newspapers reminded their readers daily that our prisoners of war, our compatriots, were languishing in evil captivity. All the Western peoples behaved the same in our war. Parcels, letters, all kinds of assistance flowed freely through the neutral countries. The Western POWs did not have to lower themselves to accept ladlefuls from German soup kettles. They talked back to the German guards. Western governments gave their captured soldiers their seniority rights, their regular promotions, even their pay. The only soldier in the world who cannot surrender is the soldier of the world's one and only Red Army. That's what it says in our military statutes. The Germans would shout at us from their trenches, "Ivan, plain nicht!" Ivan, no prisoner. Who can picture all that means? There is war, there is death, but there is no surrender. What a discovery! What it means is, go and die, we will go on living. And if you lose your legs, yet manage to return from captivity on crutches, we will convict you. The Leningrader Ivanov, commander of a machine-gun platoon in the Finnish War, was subsequently thus imprisoned in Ust-Vimelag, for example. Our soldiers alone, renounced by their motherland and degraded to nothing in the eyes of enemies and allies, had to push their way to the swine swill being doled out in the backyards of the Third Reich. Our soldiers alone had the doors shut tight to keep them from returning to their homes, although their young souls tried hard not to believe this. There was something called Article 58(1)b, and in wartime it provided only for execution by shooting. For not wanting to die from a German bullet, the prisoner had to die from a Soviet bullet, for having been a prisoner of war. Some get theirs from the enemy, and we get it from our own. Incidentally, it is very naive to say, what for? At no time have governments been moralists. They never imprisoned people and executed them for having done something. They imprisoned and executed them to keep them from doing something. They imprisoned all those POWs, of course, not for treason to the motherland, because it was absolutely clear even to a fool that only the Vlasov men could be accused of treason. They imprisoned all of them to keep them from telling their fellow villagers about Europe. What the eye doesn't see, the heart doesn't grieve for. What, then, were the courses of action open to Russian war prisoners? There was only one legally acceptable course, to lie down and let oneself be trampled to death. Every blade of grass pushes its fragile length upward in order to live. As for you, lie down and be trampled on. Even though you've been slow about it, even though you couldn't do it on the battlefield, at least die now, then you will not be prosecuted. The soldiers sleep. They spoke their word, and they are right for eternity. And every other path which, in desperation, your mind may invent is going to lead you into conflict with the law. Escape and return to the motherland, past the guards ringing the camp, across half Germany, then through Poland or the Balkans, led straight to Smersh and prison. They were asked, "How did you manage to escape when others couldn't? This stinks. Come on, you rat. What assignment did they give you?" Mikhail Bernatsev, Pavel Bondarenko, and many, many others. It has become the accepted thing for our literary critics to say that Sholokov, in his immortal story Sudbar Chelofika, The Fate of a Man, spoke the bitter truth about this side of our life, and that he revealed the problem. But we must retort that in this story, which is in general very inferior, and in which the passages about the war are pale and unconvincing, since the author evidently knew nothing about the last war, and the descriptions of Germans are unconvincing cartoon clichés, only the hero's wife is successfully portrayed, because she is a pure Christian straight out of Dostoevsky. In this story about a war prisoner, the real problem of the war prisoners was hidden or distorted. 1. The author picked the least incriminating form of being taken prisoner conceivable. The soldier was captured while unconscious, so as to make him non-controversial and to bypass the whole poignancy of the problem. What if he had been conscious when he was taken prisoner, as was most often the case? What would have happened to him then? 2. The fact that the motherland had deserted us, had renounced us, had cursed us, was not presented as the war prisoner's chief problem. Sholokov says not a word about it. But it was because of that particular factor that there was no way out. On the contrary, he identifies the presence of traitors among us as constituting the problem. But if this really was the main thing, one might then expect him to have investigated further and explained where they came from a full quarter-century after a revolution that was supported by the entire people. 3. Sholokov dreamed up a fantastic spy story escape from captivity, stretching innumerable points to avoid the obligatory, inevitable procedural step of the returned war prisoner's reception in Smersh, the identification and screening camp. Not only was Sokolov, the hero, not put behind barbed wire, as provided in the regulations, but, and this is a real joke, he was given a month's holiday by his colonel. In other words, the freedom to carry out the assignment given him by the fascist intelligence service. So his colonel would end up in the same place as he. Escaping to the Western partisans, to the resistance forces, only postponed your full reckoning with the military tribunal. Also, it made you still more dangerous. You could have acquired a very harmful spirit through living freely among Europeans, and if you had not been afraid to escape and continue to fight, it meant you were a determined person and thus doubly dangerous in the motherland. Did you survive POW camp at the expense of your compatriots and comrades? Did you become a member of the camp Polizei, or a commandant, a helper of the Germans and of death? Stalinist law did not punish you any more severely than if you had operated with the resistance forces. It was the same article of the code and the same term, and one could guess why, too. Such a person was less dangerous, but the inert law that is inexplicably implanted in us forbade this path to all except the dregs. In addition to those 4 possibilities, either impossible or unacceptable, there was a 5th, to wait for German recruiters to see what they would summon you to. Sometimes, fortunately, representatives came from German rural districts to select hired men for their farmers. Sometimes they came from corporations and picked out engineers and mechanics. According to the supreme Stalinist imperative, you should have rejected that too. You should have concealed the fact that you were an engineer. You should have concealed the fact that you were a skilled worker. As an industrial designer or electrician, you could have preserved your patriotic purity only if you had stayed in the POW camp to dig in the earth, to rot, to pick through the garbage heap. In that case, for pure treason to the motherland, you could count on getting, your head raised high in pride, 10 years in prison and 5 more muzzled. Whereas for treason to the motherland, aggravated by working for the enemy, especially in one's own profession, you've got, with bowed head, the same 10 years in prison and 5 more muzzled. And that was the jeweller's precision of a beer moth, Stalin's trademark. Now and then recruiters turned up who were of quite a different type. Russians, usually recent communist political commissars. White guards didn't accept that type of employment. These recruiters scheduled a meeting in the camp, condemned the Soviet regime, and appealed to prisoners to enlist in spy schools or in Vlasov units. People who have never starved, as our war prisoners did, who have never gnawed on bats that happened to fly into the barracks, who have never had to boil the soles of old shoes, will never understand the irresistible material force exerted by any kind of appeal, any kind of argument whatever, if behind it, on the other side of the camp gates, smoke rises from a field kitchen, and if everyone who signs up is fed a bellyful of kasha right then and there, if only once, just once more before I die. And hovering over the steaming kasha and the inducements of the recruiter was the apparition of freedom and a real life, wherever it might call, to the Vlasov battalions, to the Cossack regiments of Krasnov, to the labor battalions pouring cement in the future Atlantic Wall, to the fjords of Norway, to the sands of Libya, to the Hiwi unit, Hilfswillige, volunteers in the German Wehrmacht, there being 12 Hiwi men in each German company, and then, finally, to the village Polizei, who pursued and caught partisans, many of whom the motherland would also renounce. Wherever it might call, any place at all, at least anything, so as not to stay there and die like abandoned cattle. We ourselves, released from every obligation, not merely to his motherland, but to all humanity, the human being whom we drove to gnawing on bats. And those of our boys who agreed to become half-baked spies still had not drawn any drastic conclusions from their abandoned state. They were still, in fact, acting very patriotically. They saw this course as the least difficult means of getting out of POW camp. Almost to a man, they decided that as soon as the Germans sent them across to the Soviet side, they would turn themselves in to the authorities, turn in their equipment and instructions, and join their own benign command in laughing at the stupid Germans. They would then put on their Red Army uniforms and return to fight bravely in their units. And tell me, who, speaking in human terms, could have expected anything else? How could it have been any other way? These were straightforward, sincere men. I saw many of them. They had honest, round faces and spoke with an attractive Vyatka or Vladimir accent. They boldly joined up as spies, even though they'd had only 4 or 5 grades of rural school, and were not even competent to cope with map and compass. It appears that they picked the only way out they could, and one would suppose that the whole thing was an expensive and stupid game on the part of the German command. But no, Hitler played in rhythm and in tune with his brother dictator. Spy mania was one of the fundamental aspects of Stalin's insanity. It seemed to Stalin that the country was swarming with spies. All the Chinese who lived in the Soviet Far East were convicted as spies, Article 58(6), and were taken to the northern camps, where they perished. The same fate had awaited Chinese participants in the Soviet Civil War, if they hadn't cleared out in time. Several 100,000 Koreans were exiled to Kazakhstan, all similarly accused of spying. All Soviet citizens who at one time or another had lived abroad, who at one time or another had hung around in tourist hotels, who at one time or another happened to be photographed next to a foreigner, or who had themselves photographed a city building, the Golden Gate in Vladimir, were accused of the same crime. Those who stared too long at railroad tracks, at a highway bridge, at a factory chimney, were similarly charged. All the numerous foreign communists stranded in the Soviet Union, all the big and little Comintern officials and employees, one after another, without any individual distinctions, were charged, first of all, with espionage. Iosip Tito just barely escaped this fate, and Popov and Tanev, fellow defendants of Dimitrov in the Leipzig trial, both got prison terms. For Dimitrov himself, Stalin prepared another fate. And the Latvian riflemen, whose bayonets were the most reliable in the first years of the revolution, were also accused of espionage when they were arrested to a man in 1937. Stalin seems somehow to have twisted around and maximized the famous declaration of that coquette Catherine the Great. He would rather that 999 innocent men should rot than miss one genuine spy. Given all this, how could one believe and trust Russian soldiers who had really been in the hands of the German intelligence service? And how it eased the burden for the MGB executioners when thousands of soldiers pouring in from Europe did not even try to conceal that they had voluntarily enlisted as spies. What an astonishing confirmation of the predictions of the wisest of the wise. Come on, keep coming, you silly fools. The article and the retribution have long since been waiting for you. But it is appropriate to ask one thing more. There still were prisoners of war who did not accept recruiting offers, who never worked for the Germans at their profession or trade, and who were not camp police, who spent the whole war in POW camps without sticking their noses outside, and who, in spite of everything, did not die, however unlikely this was. For example, they made cigarette lighters out of scrap metal, like the electrical engineers Nikolai Andreevich Semyonov and Fyodor Fyodorovich Karpov, and in that way managed to get enough to eat. And did the motherland forgive them for surrendering? No, it did not forgive them. I met both Semyonov and Karpov in the Butyrki after they had already received their lawful sentence. And what was it? The alert reader already knows. 10 years of imprisonment and 5 muzzled. As brilliant engineers, they had rejected German offers to work at their profession. In 1941, Junior Lieutenant Semyonov had gone to the front as a volunteer. In 1942, he still didn't have a revolver. Instead, he had an empty holster, and the interrogator could not understand why he hadn't shot himself with his holster. He had escaped from captivity 3 times, and in 1945, after he had been liberated from a concentration camp, seated atop a tank as a member of a penalty unit of tank-borne infantry, he took part in the capture of Berlin and received the Order of the Red Star. Yet, after all that, he was finally imprisoned and sentenced. All of this mirrored our nemesis. Very few of the war prisoners returned across the Soviet border as free men, and if one happened to get through by accident because of the prevailing chaos, he was seized later on, even as late as 1946 or 1947. Some were arrested at assembly points in Germany. Others weren't arrested openly right away, but were transported from the border in freight cars under convoy to one of the numerous identification and screening camps, PFLs, scattered throughout the country. These camps differed in no way from the common run of corrective labor camps, ITLs, except that their prisoners had not yet been sentenced, but would be sentenced there. All these PFLs were also attached to some kind of factory or mine or construction project, and the former POWs, looking out on the motherland newly restored to them through the same barbed wire through which they had seen Germany, could begin work from their first day on a 10-hour workday. Those under suspicion were questioned during their rest periods, in the evenings and at night, and there were large numbers of security officers and interrogators in the PFL for this purpose. As always, the interrogation began with the hypothesis that you were obviously guilty, and you, without going outside the barbed wire, had to prove that you were not guilty. Your only available means to this end was to rely on witnesses who were exactly the same kind of POWs as you. Obviously, they might not have turned up in your own PFL. They might, in fact, be at the other end of the country. In that case, the security officers of, say, Kemerovo would send off inquiries to the security officers of Solikamsk, who would question the witnesses and send back their answers along with new inquiries, and you yourself would be questioned as a witness in some other case. True, it might take a year or 2 before your fate was resolved, but after all, the motherland was losing nothing in the process. You were out mining coal every day, and if one of your witnesses gave the wrong sort of testimony about you, or if none of your witnesses was alive, you had only yourself to blame, and you were sure to be entered in the documents as a traitor of the motherland. And the visiting military court would rubber stamp your tenor. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette.
The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1, Section 1, continued. Cassette 8, Side 2.
True, it might take a year or two before your fate was resolved, but after all, the motherland was losing nothing in the process. You were out mining coal every day, and if one of your witnesses gave the wrong sort of testimony about you, or if none of your witnesses was alive, you had only yourself to blame, and you were sure to be entered in the documents as a traitor of the motherland. And the visiting military court would rubber-stamp your tenor. And if, despite all their twisting things about, it appeared that you really hadn't worked for the Germans, and if, and this was the main point, you had not had the chance to see the Americans and English with your own eyes, to have been liberated from captivity by them instead of by us was a gravely aggravating circumstance, then the security officers would decide the degree of isolation in which you were to be held. Certain people were ordered to change their place of residence, which always breaks a person's ties with his environment and makes him more vulnerable. Others were valiantly offered the chance to go to work in the VOKHR, the Militarized Guard Service. In that situation, while nominally remaining free, a man lost all his personal freedom and was sent off to some isolated area. There was a third category. After a handshake, some were humanely permitted to return home, although even without aggravating circumstances, they deserved to be shot for having surrendered. But people in this category celebrated prematurely. Even before the former prisoner arrived home, his case had reached his home district through the secret channels of state security. These people remained eternally outsiders, and with the first mass arrests, like those of 1948 to 1949, they were immediately arrested for hostile propaganda or some other reason. I was imprisoned with people in that category, too. Oh, if I had only known! That was the refrain in the prison cells that spring. If I had only known that this was how I would be greeted, that they would deceive me so, that this would be my fate, would I have really returned to my motherland? Not for anything. I would have made my way to Switzerland, to France. I would have gone across the sea, across the ocean, across 3 oceans. In actual fact, even when POWs actually knew what would happen to them, they behaved in exactly the same way. Vasily Alexandrov was taken prisoner in Finland. He was sought out there by some elderly Petersburg merchant who asked him his name and patronymic and then said, "In 1917 I owed your grandfather a large debt, and I didn't have the chance to pay it. Here you are, take it." An old debt is a windfall. After the war, Alexandrov was accepted by the circle of Russian émigrés, and he got engaged to a girl there whom he came to love, and not just casually. To educate him, his future father-in-law gave him a bound set of Pravda, just as it was issued from 1918 to 1941, without any deletions or corrections. At the same time, he recounted to him more or less completely the history of the waves of arrests, as we have set it forth in Chapter 2 above. And nevertheless, Alexandrov abandoned his fiancée and his wealth, and returned to the USSR, where he was given, as one can easily guess, 10 years and disenfranchisement for 5 more. In 1953, he was happy to have managed to snag himself a job as foreman in a special camp. But the more thoughtful prisoners corrected them. They had made their mistake earlier. They were stupid to have dashed off to the front lines in 1941. It takes a fool to rush off to war. Right from the start, they should have gotten themselves set up in the rear, somewhere quiet. Those who did are heroes now. And it would have been an even surer thing just to desert. Almost certainly one's skin would be whole. They didn't get 10 years either, but 8 or 7. And they weren't excluded from any of the cushy jobs in camp. After all, a deserter was not regarded as an enemy or a traitor or a political prisoner. He was considered not a hostile factor, but a friendly one, a non-political offender, so to speak. That point of view aroused passionate argument and objections. The deserters had to spend all those years rotting in prison, and they would not be forgiven. But there would soon be an amnesty for everyone else. They would all be released. At that time, the principal advantage of being a deserter was still unknown. Those who had gotten in via 5810 snatched from their apartments or from the Red Army, often envied the rest. What the hell? For the very same money, in other words, for the same 10-year sentence, they could have seen so many interesting things, like those other fellows who had just about been everywhere. And here we are, about to croak in camp, without ever having seen anything beyond our own stinking stairs. Incidentally, those who were in on Article 5810 could hardly conceal their triumphant presentiment that they would be the first to be amnestied. The only ones who did not sigh, "Oh, if I had only known," because they knew very well what they were doing, and the only ones who did not expect any mercy and did not expect an amnesty, were the Vlasov men. I had known about them and been perplexed about them long before our unexpected meeting on the board bunks of prison. First there had been the leaflets, repeatedly soaked through, dried out, and lost in the high grass, uncut for the 3rd year, of the front-line strip near Orel. In December 1942 they had announced the creation in Smolensk of a Russian committee, which apparently claimed to be some sort of Russian government, and yet at the same time seemed not to be one. Evidently the Germans themselves had not yet made up their minds. For that reason the communiqué seemed to be a hoax. There was a photograph of General Vlasov in the leaflets, and his biography was outlined. In the fuzzy photograph his face looked well-fed and successful, like all our generals of the new stripe. They told me later that this wasn't so, that Vlasov's face was more like that of a Western general, high, thin, with horn-rimmed glasses. His biography testified to a penchant for success. He had begun in a peasant family, and 1937 had not broken his skyrocketing career. Nor was it ruined by his service as a military advisor to Chiang Kai-shek. The first and only disaster of his earlier life had occurred when his second shock army, after being encircled, was ineptly abandoned to die of starvation. But how much of that whole biography could be believed? As far as one can establish at this late date, Andrei Andreevich Vlasov, prevented by the revolution from completing his studies at the Nizhny Novgorod Orthodox Seminary, was drafted into the Red Army in 1919 and fought as an enlisted man. On the southern front, against Denikin and Wrangel, he rose to be commander of a platoon, then of a company. In the 20s, he completed the Vistral courses. He became a member of the Communist Party in 1930. In 1936, having attained the rank of regimental commander, he was sent to China as a military advisor. Evidently he had no ties to the top military and party circles, and he therefore turned up naturally in that Stalinist second echelon of officers promoted to replace the purged commanders of armies, divisions, and brigades. From 1938 on, he commanded a division, and in 1940, when new, in other words old, officer ranks were created, he became a major general. From additional information, one can conclude that in that corps of newly made generals, many of whom were totally stupid and inexperienced, Vlasov was one of the most talented. His 99th Infantry Division, which he had instructed and trained from the summer of 1940 on, was not caught off balance by the German attack. On the contrary, while the rest of the army reeled backward, his division advanced, retook Przemysl, and held it for 6 days. Quickly skipping the rank of corps commander, in 1941 Lieutenant General Vlasov was in command of the 37th Army near Kiev. He made his way out of the enormous Kiev encirclement, and in December 1941, near Moscow, he commanded the 20th Army, whose successful Soviet counter-offensive for defense of the capital, the taking of Solnechnogorsk, was noted in the Sovinformbureau communiqué for December the 12th. And the list of generals mentioned there was as follows: Zhukov, Lelyushenko, Kuznetsov, Vlasov, Rokossovsky, Govorov. Thanks to the speed with which officers were promoted in those months, he became deputy commander of the Volkov front under Meretskov, and took over command of the 2nd Shock Army. On January the 7th, 1942, at the head of that army, he began a drive to break the Leningrad blockade, an attack across the Volkov River to the northwest. This had been planned as a combined operation, a concerted push from several directions and from Leningrad itself. At scheduled intervals, the 54th, the 4th, and the 52nd Armies were to take part in it also. But those three armies either did not advance because they were unready, or else came to a quick halt. At that time we still didn't have the capacity to plan such complex combined operations, and more importantly, provide supplies for them. Vlasov's second shock army, however, was successful in its assault, and by February 1942 it was 46 miles deep inside the German lines. And from then on, the reckless Stalinist Supreme Command could find neither men nor ammunition to reinforce even those troops. That's the kind of reserves they had begun the offensive with. Leningrad, too, was left to die behind the blockade, having received no specific information from Novgorod. During March, the winter roads still held up. From April on, however, the entire swampy area through which the Second Army had advanced melted into mud, and there were no supply roads, and there was no help from the air. The army was without food, and at the same time Vlasov was refused permission to retreat. For 2 months they endured starvation and extermination. In the Butyrki, soldiers from that army told me how they had cut off the hoofs of dead and rotting horses and boiled the scrapings and eaten them. Then, on May the 14th, a German attack was launched from all sides against the encircled army. The only planes in the air, of course, were German, and only then, in mockery, were they given permission to pull back behind the Volkhov. They made several hopeless attempts to break through, until the beginning of July. And so it was that Vlasov's second shock army perished, literally recapitulating the fate of Samsonov's Russian Second Army in World War I, having been just as insanely thrown into encirclement. Now this, of course, was treason to the motherland. This, of course, was vicious, self-obsessed betrayal. But it was Stalin's. Treason does not necessarily involve selling out for money. It can include ignorance and carelessness in the preparations for war, confusion and cowardice at its very start, the meaningless sacrifice of armies and corps solely for the sake of saving one's own marshal's uniform. Indeed, what more bitter treason is there on the part of a supreme commander-in-chief? Unlike Samsonov, Vlasov did not commit suicide. After his army had been wiped out, he wandered among the woods and swamps, and on July the 6th personally surrendered in the area of Siverskaya. He was taken to the German headquarters near Lutzen in East Prussia, where they were holding several captured generals and a brigade political commissar, G.N. Zhilenkov, formerly a successful party official, and secretary of one of the Moscow district party committees. These captives had already confessed their disagreement with the policy of the Stalin government, but they had no real leader. Vlasov became it. From his photograph, it was impossible to believe that he was an outstanding man, or that for long years he had suffered profoundly for Russia. As for the leaflets reporting the creation of the ROA, the Russian Liberation Army, not only were they written in bad Russian, but they were imbued with an alien spirit that was clearly German, and moreover seemed little concerned with their presumed subject. Besides, and on the other hand, they contained crude boasting about the plentiful chow available, and the cheery mood of the soldiers. Somehow, one couldn't believe in that army, and if it really did exist, what kind of cheery mood could it be in? Only a German could lie like that. In reality, there was no Russian Liberation Army until almost the very end of the war. Both the name and the insignia devised for it were invented by a German of Russian origin, Captain Strickfeld, in the Ostpropagandaabteilung. Although he held only a minor position, he had influence, and he tried to convince the Hitlerite leadership that a German-Russian alliance was essential, and that the Russians should be encouraged to collaborate with Germany. A vain undertaking for both sides. Each side wanted only to use and deceive the other. But in the given situation, the Germans had power. They were on top of the setup, and the Vlasov officers had only their fantasy, at the bottom of the abyss. There was no such army, but anti-Soviet formations made up of Soviet citizens were organized from the very start of the war. The first to support the Germans were the Lithuanians. In the 1 year we had been there, we had aroused their deep, angry hostility. And then the SS Galicia Division was created from Ukrainian volunteers, and Estonian units afterward. In the fall of 1941, Guard companies appeared in Byelorussia, and a Tatar battalion in the Crimea. We ourselves had sowed the seeds of all this. Take, for example, our stupid 20-year policy of closing and destroying the Muslim mosques in the Crimea, and compare that with the policy of the far-sighted conqueror Catherine the Great, who contributed state funds for building and expanding the Crimean mosques. And the Hitlerites, when they arrived, were smart enough to present themselves as their defenders. Later, Caucasian detachments and Cossack armies, more than a cavalry corps, put in an appearance on the German side. In the first winter of the war, platoons and companies of Russian volunteers began to be formed. But the German command was very distrustful of these Russian units, and their master sergeants and lieutenants were Germans. Only their non-coms below master sergeant were Russian. They also used such German commands as Achtung, Halt, etc. More significant and entirely Russian were the following units: a brigade in Lokot, in Bryansk province, from November 1941, when a local teacher of engineering, K.P. Voskoboynikov, proclaimed the National Labour Party of Russia and issued a manifesto to the citizens of the nation, hoisting the flag of St. George. A unit in the Ozentorf settlement near Orsha, formed at the beginning of 1942 under the leadership of Russian émigrés. It must be said that only a small group of Russian émigrés joined this movement, and even they did not conceal their anti-German feelings, and allowed many crossovers, including a whole battalion, to the Soviet side, after which they were dropped by the Germans. And a unit formed by Gil in the summer of 1942 near Lublin. V.V. Gil, a Communist Party member, and even, it seems, a Jew, not only survived as a POW, but with the help of other POWs became the head of a camp near Suwalki, and offered to create a fighting alliance of Russian nationalists for the Germans. However, there was as yet no Russian Liberation Army in all of this, and no Vlasov. The companies under German command were put on the Russian front as an experiment, and the Russian units were sent against the Bryansk, Orsha, and Polish partisans. We soon discovered that there really were Russians fighting against us, and that they fought harder than any SS men. In July 1943, for example, near Orel, a platoon of Russians in German uniform defended Sobokinskaya Viselki. They fought with a desperation that might have been expected if they had built the place themselves. One of them was driven into a root cellar. They threw hand grenades in after him, and he fell silent. But they had no more than stuck their heads in than he let them have another volley from his automatic pistol. Only when they lobbed in an anti-tank grenade did they find out that, within the root cellar, he had another foxhole in which he had taken shelter from the infantry grenades. Just try to imagine the degree of shock, deafness, and hopelessness in which he had kept on fighting. They defended, for example, the unshakable Dnieper bridgehead south of Tursk. For 2 weeks we continued to fight there for a mere few hundred yards. The battles were fierce in December 1943, and so was the cold. Through many long days, both we and they went through the extreme trials of winter, fighting in winter camouflage cloaks that covered our overcoats and caps. Near Malie Kozlovici, I was told, an interesting encounter took place. As the soldiers dashed back and forth among the pines, things got confused, and 2 soldiers lay down next to one another. No longer very accurately oriented, they both kept shooting at someone somewhere over there. Both had Soviet automatic pistols. They shared their cartridges, praised one another, and together swore at the grease freezing on their automatic pistols. Finally their pistols stopped firing altogether, and they decided to take a break and light up. They pulled back their white hoods, and at the same instant each saw the other's cap, the eagle and the star. They jumped up. Their automatic pistols still refused to fire, Grabbing them by the barrel and swinging them like clubs, they began to go at each other. This, if you will, was not politics, and not the motherland, but just sheer caveman distrust. If I take pity on him, he is going to kill me. In East Prussia, a trio of captured Vlasov men was being marched along the roadside a few steps away from me. At that moment, a T-34 tank thundered down the highway. Suddenly, one of the captives twisted around and dived underneath the tank. The tank veered, but the edge of its track crushed him nevertheless. The broken man lay writhing, bloody foam coming from his mouth. And one could certainly understand him. He preferred a soldier's death to being hanged in a dungeon. They had no choice. There was no other way for them to fight. They had no chance to find a way out, to safeguard their lives by some more cautious mode of fighting. If pure surrender was considered unforgivable treason to the motherland, then what about those who had taken up enemy arms? Our propaganda, in all its crudity, explained their conduct as 1. Treason. Was it biologically based, carried in the bloodstream? Or 2. Cowardice, which it certainly was not. A coward tries to find a spot where things are easy, soft, safe. And men could be induced to enter the Wehrmacht's Vlasov detachments only in the last extremity, only at the limit of desperation, only out of inexhaustible hatred of the Soviet regime, only with total contempt for their own safety. For they knew they would never have the faintest glimpse of mercy. When we captured them, we shot them as soon as the first intelligible Russian word came from their mouths. In Russian captivity, as in German captivity, the worst lot of all was reserved for the Russians. In general, this war revealed to us that the worst thing in the world was to be a Russian. I recall with shame an incident I observed during the liquidation, in other words the plundering, of the Bobruisk encirclement, when I was walking along the highway among wrecked and overturned German automobiles, and a wealth of booty lay scattered everywhere. German cart horses wandered aimlessly in and out of a shallow depression where wagons and automobiles that had gotten stuck were buried in the mud, and bonfires of booty were smoking away. Then I heard a cry for help. "Mr. Captain! Mr. Captain!" A prisoner on foot in German breeches was crying out to me in pure Russian. He was naked from the waist up, and his face, chest, shoulders, and back were all bloody, while a sergeant Osobist, a security man, seated on a horse, drove him forward with a whip, pushing him with his horse. He kept lashing that naked back up and down with the whip, without letting him turn around, without letting him ask for help. He drove him along, beating and beating him, raising new crimson welts on his skin. And this was not one of the Punic Wars, nor a war between the Greeks and the Persians. Any officer possessing any authority in any army on earth ought to have stopped that senseless torture. In any army on earth, yes, but in ours? Given our fierce and uncompromising method of dividing mankind, if you are not with us, if you are not our own, etc., then you deserve nothing but contempt and annihilation. So I was afraid to defend the Vlasov men against the Osobist. I said nothing, and I did nothing. I passed him by as if I could not hear him, so that I myself would not be infected by that universally recognized plague. What if the Vlasov man was indeed some kind of supervillain? Or maybe the Osobist would think something was wrong with me, and then... Or, putting it more simply for anyone who knows anything about the situation in the Soviet army at that time, would that Osobist have paid any attention to an army captain? So the Osobist continued to lash the defenseless man brutally and drive him along like a beast. This picture will remain etched in my mind forever. This, after all, is almost a symbol of the archipelago. It ought to be on the jacket of this book. The Vlasov men had a presentiment of all this. They knew it ahead of time. Nevertheless, on the left sleeve of their German uniforms they sewed the shield with the white-blue-red edging, the field of St. Andrew, and the letters ROA. These letters became even better known, although, as before, there was still no real Russian Liberation Army. The units were all scattered and kept subordinate to German orders, and the Vlasov generals had nothing to do but play cards in Dahlem-Dorf, near Berlin. By the middle of 1942, Vosko-Bonyakov's brigade, which after his death was commanded by Kaminsky, numbered 5 infantry regiments of 2,500 to 3,000 men each, with attached artillery crews, a tank battalion consisting of 24 Soviet tanks, and an artillery battalion with 36 guns. The commanding officers were POW officers, and the rank and file was made up, in considerable part, of local Bryansk volunteers. This brigade was under orders to guard the area against partisans. In the summer of 1942, the brigade of Gil Blazevich was transferred for the same purpose from Poland, where it had been notable for its cruelty toward Poles and Jews, to the area near Mogilev. At the beginning of 1943, its command refused to acknowledge Vlasov's authority, demanding that he explain why, in his stated program, there was no reference to the struggle against world Jewry and Jew-loving commissars. These were the very men, called the Rodionovites, because Gil had changed his name to Rodionov, who in August 1943, when Hitler's approaching defeat became apparent, changed their black flag with a silver skull to a red flag and proclaimed Soviet authority and a large partisan region in the northeast corner of Byelorussia. At that time, Soviet newspapers began to write about the partisan region, but without explaining its origins. Later on, all surviving Rodionovites were imprisoned. And whom did the Germans immediately throw in against the Rodionovites? The Kaminsky Brigade. That was in May 1944, and they also threw in 13 of their own divisions in an effort to liquidate the partisan region. That was the extent to which Germans understood all those tricolor cockades, St. George and the field of St. Andrew. The Russian and German languages were mutually untranslatable, inexpressible, uncorrelatable. Still worse, in October 1944, the Germans threw in Kaminsky's brigade, with its Muslim units, to suppress the Warsaw uprising. While one group of Russians sat traitorously dozing beyond the Vistula, watching the death of Warsaw through their binoculars, other Russians crushed the uprising. Hadn't the Poles had enough Russian villainy to bear in the 19th century without having to endure more of it in the 20th? For that matter, was that the last of it? Perhaps more is still to come. The career of the Osintorf Battalion was apparently more straightforward. This consisted of about 600 soldiers and 200 officers, with an émigré command, I.K. Sakharov and Lambsdorff, Russian uniforms, and a white, blue, red flag. It was thrown in near Pskov. Then, reinforced to regimental strength, it was readied for a parachute drop on the line of Vologda-Archangel, the idea being to make use of the nest of concentration camps in that area. Throughout 1943, Igor Sakharov managed to prevent his unit from being sent against the partisans, but then he was replaced, and the battalion was first disarmed and imprisoned in a camp, and then sent off to the Western Front. Then, in the fall of 1943, the Germans decided to send the Russian cannon fodder to the Atlantic Wall, and against the French and Italian resistance, having lost, forgotten, and not even tried to recall its original purpose. Those among the Vlasov men who had managed to retain some kind of political rationality or hope, thereupon lost both. The inhabitants of the occupied areas held them in contempt as German hirelings. So did the Germans, because of their Russian blood. Their pitiful little newspapers were worked over with a German censor's broadsword, Greater Germany and the Führer. And the Vlasov men had one way out of all that, to fight to the death, and when they were not fighting, to down vodka and more vodka. Foredoomed. That was their existence during all their years of war and alien lands, and there was no salvation for them from any direction. Hitler and those around him, even when they were retreating on every front and were staring their own destruction in the face, could still not overcome their intense distrust of wholly separate Russian units. They could not bring themselves to organize divisions that were entirely Russian, to allow even the shadow of a Russia that was not totally subject to them. Only in the crack of the final debacle in November 1944 was a belated theatrical production at last permitted in Prague, the creation of a Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia, combining all the different national groups and a manifesto, which, like everything that had preceded it, was neither fish nor fowl, since the concept of a Russia independent of Germany and Nazism was still not tolerated. Vlasov became chairman of the committee, and only in the fall of 1944 did they begin to form Vlasov divisions that were exclusively Russian. They were the first, based on the Kaminsky Brigade under S.K. Bunyachenko, the second under Zverev, former military commandant of Kharkov, half the third, segments of the fourth, and Maltsev's Air Force detachment. Only 4 divisions were authorized. Probably the wise German political leaders had concluded that at this point the Russian workers in Germany, the Ostovtsi, would rush to take up arms. But the Red Army was already on the Vistula and the Danube, and ironically, as though to confirm the far-sightedness of the very near-sighted Germans, those Vlasov divisions, in their first and last independent action, dealt a blow to the Germans themselves. In the general disaster, Vlasov gathered up his 2.5 divisions near Prague at the end of April, without coordinating his action with the German Supreme Command. It became known at this point that SS General Steiner was preparing to destroy the Czech capital rather than surrender it intact, and Vlasov ordered his divisions to the aid of the Czech rebels. And at that point, all the hurt, bitterness, and anger against the Germans that had accumulated during 3 cruel and futile years in the breasts of the enslaved Russians was vented in the attack on the Germans. They were shoved out of Prague from an unexpected direction. Did all Czechs realize later which Russians had saved their city? Our own history is similarly distorted. We claim that Prague was saved by Soviet armies, although they couldn't have gotten there in time. Then the Vlasov army began to retreat toward Bavaria and the Americans. They were pinning all their hopes on the possibility of being useful to the Allies. In this way, their years of dangling in the German noose would finally become meaningful. But the Americans greeted them with a wall of armor and forced them to surrender to Soviet hands, as stipulated by the Yalta Conference. In Austria that May, Churchill perpetrated the same sort of act of a loyal ally, but out of our accustomed modesty we did not publicize it. He turned over to the Soviet command the Cossack corps of 90,000 men. This surrender was an act of double-dealing consistent with the spirit of traditional English diplomacy. The heart of the matter was that the Cossacks were determined to fight to the death, or to cross the ocean all the way to Paraguay or Indochina if they had to. Anything rather than surrender alive. Therefore the English proposed, first, that the Cossacks give up their arms on the pretext of replacing them with standardized weapons. Then the officers, without the enlisted men, were summoned to a supposed conference on the future of the army in the city of Judenburg in the English occupation zone. But the English had secretly turned the city over to the Soviet armies the night before. 40 busloads of officers, all the way from commanders of companies on up to General Krasnov himself, crossed a high viaduct and drove straight down into a semicircle of black Marias, next to which stood convoy guards with lists in their hands. The road back was blocked by Soviet tanks. The officers didn't even have anything with which to shoot themselves or to stab themselves to death, since their weapons had been taken away. They jumped from the viaduct onto the paving stones below. Immediately afterward, and just as treacherously, the English turned over the rank-and-file soldiers by the trainload, pretending that they were on their way to receive new weapons from their commanders. In their own countries, Roosevelt and Churchill are honored as embodiments of statesmanlike wisdom. To us, in our Russian prison conversations, their consistent short-sightedness and stupidity stood out as astonishingly obvious. How could they, in their decline from 1941 to 1945, fail to secure any guarantees whatever of the independence of Eastern Europe? How could they give away broad regions of Saxony and Thuringia in exchange for the preposterous toy of a 4-zone Berlin, their own future Achilles' heel? And what was the military or political sense in their surrendering to destruction at Stalin's hands hundreds of thousands of armed Soviet citizens determined not to surrender? They say it was the price they paid for Stalin's agreeing to enter the war against Japan. With the atom bomb already in their hands, they paid Stalin for not refusing to occupy Manchuria, for strengthening Mao Zedong in China, and for giving Kim Il-sung control of half Korea. What bankruptcy of political thought! And when, subsequently, the Russians pushed out Mikolajik, when Benesch and Masaryk came to their ends, when Berlin was blockaded, and Budapest flamed and fell silent, and Korea went up in smoke, and Britain's conservatives fled from Suez, could one really believe that those among them with the most accurate memories did not at least recall that episode of the Cossacks? Along with them he also handed over many wagon-loads of old people, women and children, who did not want to return to their native Cossack rivers. This great hero, monuments to whom will in time cover all England, ordered that they, too, be surrendered to their deaths. In addition to the hurriedly created Vlasov divisions, quite a few Russian sub-units went right on turning sour in the depths of the German army, wearing standard German uniforms. They finished out the war on various sectors and in different ways. I myself fell under Vlasov fire a few days before my arrest. There were Russians in the East Prussian sack, which we had surrounded, and one night at the end of January their unit tried to break through our position to the west, without artillery preparation, in silence. There was no firmly delineated front in any case, and they penetrated us in depth, catching my sound locator battery, which was out in front, in a pincers. I just barely managed to pull it back by the last remaining road. But then I went back for a piece of damaged equipment, and before dawn I watched as they suddenly rose from the snow where they dug in, wearing their winter camouflage cloaks, hurled themselves with a cheer on the battery of a 152mm gun battalion at Adlich-Schwenkitten, and knocked out 12 heavy cannon with hand grenades before they could fire a shot. Pursued by their tracer bullets, our last little group ran almost 2 miles in fresh snow to the bridge across the Pasarga River. And there they were stopped. Soon after that I was arrested. And now, on the eve of the victory parade, here we all were sitting together on the board bunks of the Butyrki. I took puffs from their cigarettes, and they took puffs from mine. And paired with one or another of them, I used to carry out the 6-bucket tin latrine barrel. Many of the Vlasov men, like the spies for hire, were young, born, say, between 1915 and 1922, that same young and unknown tribe which hustling, bustling Lunacharsky had hurried to greet in the name of Pushkin. Most of them got into Vlasov military units through that same blind chance which led their comrades in a neighboring camp to get into the spy thing. It all depended on which recruiter had gone where. The recruiters had explained to them jeeringly, or rather it would have been jeering if it hadn't been the truth, "Stalin has renounced you. Stalin doesn't give a damn about you." Soviet law had outlawed them even before they outlawed themselves. So they signed up, some of them simply to get out of a death camp, others with the hope of going over to the partisans. And some of them did, and fought side by side with the partisans. But according to Stalin's rules, that didn't soften their sentences in the least. However, in the case of some, the shame of 1941, that stunning defeat after long, long years of braggadocio, ate at their hearts. Some believed that the primary guilt for those inhuman POW camps belonged to Stalin. They, too, wanted the chance to speak out about themselves and their awful experience, to affirm that they, too, were particles of Russia, and wanted to influence Russia's future, and not to be the puppets of other people's mistakes. But fate played them an even bitterer trick, and they became more abject pawns than before. The Germans, in their shallow stupidity and self-importance, allowed them only to die for the German Reich, but denied them the right to plan an independent destiny for Russia. And the Allies were 2,000 versts away, and anyway, what kind of allies would they indeed turn out to be? The term Vlasovite in our country has the same force as the word sewage. We feel we are dirtying our mouths merely by pronouncing it, and therefore no one dares utter a sentence with Vlasovite as its subject. But that is no way to write history. Now, a quarter of a century later, when most of them have perished in camps and those who have survived are living out their lives in the far north, I would like to issue a reminder, through these pages, that this was a phenomenon totally unheard of in all world history. that several 100,000 young men, aged 20 to 30, took up arms against their fatherland as allies of its most evil enemy. This, in fact, is the number of Soviet citizens who were in the Wehrmacht, in pre-Vlasov and Vlasov formations, and in the Cossack, Muslim, Baltic, and Ukrainian units and detachments. Perhaps there is something to ponder here. Who was more to blame, those youths or the grey fatherland? One cannot explain this treason biologically. It has to have had a social cause. Because, as the old proverb says, well-fed horses don't rampage. Then picture to yourself a field in which starved, neglected, crazed horses are rampaging back and forth. That same spring, many Russian émigrés were also in those cells. It was very like a dream, the resurrection of buried history. The weighty tomes on the Civil War had long since been completed, and their covers shut tight. The causes for which people fought in it had been decided. The chronology of its events had been set down in textbooks. The leaders of the white movement were, it appeared, no longer our contemporaries on earth, but mere ghosts of a past that had melted away. The Russian émigrés had been more cruelly dispersed than the tribes of Israel, and, in our Soviet imagination, if they were still dragging out their lives somewhere, it was as pianists in stinking little restaurants, as lackeys, laundresses, beggars, morphine and cocaine addicts, and virtual corpses. Right up to 1941, when the war came, it would have been impossible to find out from any hints in our newspapers, our lofty literature, our criticism of the arts, nor did our own well-fed masters of art and literature help us find out, that Russia abroad was a great spiritual world, that in it Russian philosophy was living and developing, that out there were philosophers like Bulgakov, Berdyaev, and Lossky, that Russian art had enchanted the world, that Rachmaninoff, Shaliapin, Benoit, Diaghilev, Pavlova, and the Don Cossack chorus of Yarov were out there, that profound studies of Dostoevsky were being undertaken, at a time when he was anathema in the Soviet Union, that the incredible writer Nabokov-Sirin also existed out there, that Bunin himself was still alive and had been writing for all these 20 years, that journals of the arts were being published, that theatrical works were being produced, that Russians from the same areas of Russia came together in groups where their mother tongue could be heard, and that émigré men had not given up marrying émigré women, who in turn presented them with children, which meant young people our own age. The picture of emigration presented in our country was so falsified that if one had conducted a mass survey to ask which side the Russian émigrés were on in the Spanish Civil War, or else perhaps what side they were on in the Second World War, with one voice everyone would have replied, for Franco, for Hitler. Even now people in our country do not know that many more white émigrés fought on the Republican side in Spain, that both the Vlasov divisions and the Cossack Corps von Panvitz, the Krasnov Corps, were made up of Soviet citizens and not of émigrés. The émigrés did not support Hitler. They ostracized Merezhovsky and Gippius, who took Hitler's part, leaving them to alienated loneliness. There was a joke, except it wasn't a joke, to the effect that Denikin wanted to fight for the Soviet Union against Hitler, and that at one time Stalin planned to arrange his return to the motherland, not for military reasons, obviously, but as a symbol of national unity. This book is continued on Cassette 9, Side 1. Whether fish or
worldwide, ladies.
of the Academy of Science.
The Gulag Archipelago, 1918 to 1956. An experiment in literary investigation by Aleksandr. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1, Section 1, concluded. Cassette 9, Side 1.
There was a joke, except it wasn't a joke, to the effect that Denikin wanted to fight for the Soviet Union against Hitler, and that at one time Stalin planned to arrange his return to the motherland, not for military reasons, obviously, but as a symbol of national unity. During the German occupation of France, a horde of Russian émigrés, young and old, joined the resistance. And after the liberation of Paris, they swarmed to the Soviet embassy to apply for permission to return to the motherland. No matter what kind of Russia it was still Russia. That was their slogan, and that is how they proved they had not been lying previously about their love for her. Imprisoned in 1945 and 1946, they were almost happy that these prison bars and these jailers were their own, Russian. And they observed with surprise the Soviet boys scratching their heads and saying, "Why the hell did we come back? Wasn't there room enough for us in Europe?" But, given that Stalinist logic which said that every Soviet person who had lived abroad had to be imprisoned in camp, how could the émigrés possibly escape the same lot? In the Balkans, Central Europe, Harbin, they were arrested as soon as the Soviet armies arrived. They were arrested in their apartments and on the street, just like Soviet citizens. For a while, state security arrested only men, and not all of them, only those who had in one way or another revealed a political bias. Later on, their families were transported to exile in Russia, but some were left where they were in Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia. In France, they were welcomed into Soviet citizenship with honors and flowers, and sent back to the motherland in comfort. And only when they got to the USSR were they raked in. Things dragged out longer for the Shanghai émigrés. In 1945, Russian hands didn't reach that far. But a plenipotentiary from the Soviet government went to Shanghai and announced a decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet extending forgiveness to all émigrés. Well now, how could one refuse to believe that? The government certainly couldn't lie. Whether or not there actually was such a decree, it did not, in any case, tie the hands of the organs. The Shanghai Russians expressed their delight. They were told they could take with them as many possessions as they wanted and whatever they wanted. They went home with automobiles. The country could put them to good use. They were told they could settle wherever they wanted to in the Soviet Union and, of course, work at any profession or trade. They were transported from Shanghai in steamships. The fate of the passengers varied. On some of the ships, for some reason, they were given no food at all. They also suffered various fates after reaching the port of Nakhodka, which was, incidentally, one of the main transit centers of Gulag. Almost all of them were loaded into freight cars like prisoners, except that they had as yet no strict convoy and there were no police dogs. Some of them were actually delivered to inhabited places, to cities, and allowed to live there for 2 or 3 years. Others were delivered in trainloads straight to their camps and were dumped out somewhere off a high embankment into the forest beyond the Volga, together with their white pianos and their jardinières. In 1948 to 1949, the former Far Eastern émigrés who had until then managed to stay out of camps were scraped up to the last man. As a 9-year-old boy, I had read the small, dark blue books of V.V. Shulgin with more interest than I had read Jules Verne. At that time, they were sold openly in our bookstalls. His was a voice from a world that had disappeared with such finality that not even the most extravagant fantasy could have projected that invisible point in the soundless corridors of the big Lubyanka, where his steps would intersect my own before 20 years had passed. True, I would not meet the man himself until another 20 years had gone by. But I had time to study attentively many émigrés, old and young, in the spring of 1945. I underwent a medical examination with Captain Borsches and Colonel Mariushkin, and the pitiful sight of their naked, wrinkled, dark yellow bodies, not bodies any longer but mummies, has always remained before my eyes. They were arrested 5 minutes this side of the grave, so to speak, and brought to Moscow from several thousand miles away, and there in Moscow in 1945, an interrogation was proceeding in the most serious way on their struggle against Soviet power in 1919. We have become so used to the piling up of injustices during interrogation and trial that we have ceased drawing any distinctions of degree between them. This captain and this colonel were veteran officers of the Tsar's Russian army. They had both been over 40, and they had both served in the army for 20 years, when the telegraph brought them news that the Tsar had been overthrown in Petrograd. For 20 years they had served the Tsar according to their oath. And now, against their wills, for all we know, possibly muttering, "Beat it, scram," to themselves, they swore loyalty to the provisional government. After that, no one asked them to swear any more oaths because the whole army fell apart. They didn't like the new scheme of things, wherein soldiers tore shoulder boards off officers and killed them, and it was natural for them to join other officers to fight against it. And it was natural for the Red Army to fight against them and push them into the sea. But in a country in which at least the rudiments of jurisprudence exist, what basis was there for putting them on trial? And a quarter of a century later at that. They had lived as private persons all that time, Mariushkin up to the very moment of his arrest. Borscht, to be sure, had turned up in a Cossack wagon train in Austria, but in a transport with the old men and women, not in an armed unit. However, in 1945, in the very center of Soviet jurisdiction, they were charged with actions directed toward the overthrow of the government of the Workers' and Peasants' Soviets, armed incursion into Soviet territory, in other words, not having immediately left Russia when Petrograd was declared Soviet, aiding the international bourgeoisie, which they had never seen even in their dreams, serving counter-revolutionary governments, that is, their own generals, to whom they had been subordinate all their lives. And all these sections, numbers 1, 2, 4, 13, of Article 58, were included in a criminal code adopted in 1926, that is, 6 to 7 years after the end of the Civil War. This was a classic and unconscionable example of the ex post facto application of a law. In addition, Article 2 of the Code specified that it applied only to citizens taken into custody on the territory of the Russian Republic. But State Security's strong right arm had grabbed people who were in no wise Soviet citizens from all the countries of Europe and Asia. On this basis, no single African leader has any assurance that we will not, 10 years from now, promulgate a law in accordance with which we will put him on trial for what he does today. Yes, the Chinese, in fact, will promulgate precisely such laws. Just give them the chance to reach out that far. And we won't even bring up the question of statutes of limitations. This question was provided for very flexibly. No statutes of limitations applied to Article 58. Why stir up the past, indeed? Such statutes are invoked only in the case of our homegrown executioners, who have destroyed many, many more of their compatriots than did the whole Civil War. Mariushkin, at least, remembered everything clearly. He told us the details of being evacuated from Novorossiysk. But Borscht had already descended into second childhood and prattled on and on about celebrating Easter in the Lubyanka. He had eaten only half his bread ration during Palm Sunday week and Holy Week, and had set the rest of it aside, gradually replacing the stale pieces with fresh ones. Thus he had accumulated 7 full rations when it came time to break the Lenten fast, and he had feasted for the 3 days of Easter. I do not know what kind of white guards they were in the Civil War, either of them, whether they were among the exceptional few who hung every 10th worker without trial and whipped the peasants, or whether they were the other kind, the soldierly majority. The fact that they were being interrogated and sentenced in Moscow was no proof of anything, nor a matter of any consequence. But if, from that time on, they had lived for a quarter of a century, not as retired officers on pensions and with honor, but as homeless exiles, then how could anyone point to any moral basis for trying them? That is the kind of dialectic Anatole France mastered, but which we cannot seem to grasp. According to Anatole France, by the time it's today, Yesterday's martyr is already in the wrong. In fact, from the first minute the red shirt covered his body, and vice versa. But our version is, if they rode me for one short year when I had just outgrown being a foal, then I am called a riding horse all my life, even though I have long since been used only as a cab horse. Colonel Konstantin Konstantinovich Yasevich was very different from these helpless émigré mummies. For him, clearly, the end of the Civil War had not ended the struggle against Bolshevism. As to how he continued to struggle, where and with what, he did not enlighten me. But the sense that he was still in the service remained with him in the cell itself. In the midst of all the chaotic concepts, the blurred and broken lines of vision in most of our heads, he had evidently a clear and exact view of everything around him. As a result of this reasoned point of view on life, his body, too, exhibited a steady strength, resiliency, and activity. He was certainly not less than 60. His head was totally bald, without a single hair. He had already survived his interrogation and was awaiting his sentence, like the rest of us. He could expect no help from anywhere, of course, but he kept his young, even, rosy skin. Among all of us in the cell, he alone did exercises every morning, and washed himself at the faucet. The rest of us were trying not to squander the calories in our prison ration. He put his time to use, and whenever an aisle opened up between the rows of board bunks, he paced those 15 to 20 feet with a precise stride and a precise profile, crossing his arms over his chest and staring through the walls with clear, young eyes. And the difference between us and him was that we were all astonished at what was happening to us, while nothing around him contradicted his expectations, and precisely for that reason he was absolutely alone in the cell. A year later, I was able to appraise his conduct in prison. Once again, I was in the Butyrki, and in one of those 70 cells I met some young co-defendants of Yasevich who had already been sentenced to 10 and 15 years. The sentences given everyone in their group were typed out on cigarette paper, and for some reason they had it in their possession. Yasevich was first on the list, and his sentence was to be shot. So that was what he saw, what he foresaw, through the wall with his still young eyes as he paced back and forth from the table to the door. But his unimpaired consciousness of the correctness of his path in life lent him extraordinary strength. Among the émigrés was one my own age, Igor Tronko. We became friends. Both of us were weak, dried out. Our skin was greyish-yellow on our bones. Why had we collapsed to such an extent? I think the main cause was spiritual confusion. Both of us were thin and on the tall side, and we were shaken by the gusts of summer wind in the Butyrki courtyard. We always walked side by side with the careful steps of old men, and discussed the parallels in our lives. He had been born in South Russia the same year as I. We were still nursing babes when fate stuck her hand into her well-worn purse and drew out a short straw for me and a long one for him. So it was that he rolled off across the sea, even though his white-garbed father was just a rank-and-file, unpropertied telegrapher. I found it interesting in the extreme to picture through his life all those compatriots of my generation who had landed outside Russia. They had grown up under good family supervision, and in very modest, even meagre, circumstances. They were all very well brought up, and, within the range of existing possibilities, well educated. They grew up without knowing fear or oppression, though the white organizations maintained a certain yoke of authority over them until they themselves grew strong. They grew up in such a way that the sins to which all European youth was subject in that period, a high crime rate, a frivolous attitude toward life, thoughtlessness, dissipation, did not touch them. That was because they grew up, so to speak, in the shadow of the indelible misfortune which had befallen their families. Whatever country they grew up in, they looked on Russia alone as their motherland. Their spiritual upbringing was based on Russian literature, all the more beloved because to them it was the beginning and end of their motherland, because for them their motherland did not exist as a primary geographical and physical fact. The contemporary printed word was much more generally accessible to them than to us, but they received Soviet books in conspicuously small quantities. and they felt this lack all the more keenly. It seemed to them chiefly responsible for their inability to understand what was most important, highest, and most beautiful in Soviet Russia, and that the books they did receive presented a distortion, a lie, were incomplete. The picture they had of our real life was very, very faint, but their longing for their motherland was such that if we had called on them in 1941, they would all have joined the Red Army, and it would have been even sweeter for them to die than to survive. These young people from 25 to 27 already represented and firmly defended several points of view in definite conflict with the opinions of the old generals and political leaders. Thus, Igor's group was called the Nepredrashentsy, the non-prejudges. They declared that anyone who had not shared with the motherland the whole complex burden of the past decades had no right to decide anything about the future of Russia, nor even to presuppose anything, but should simply go and lend his strength to whatever the people might decide. We would often lie beside one another on the wooden bunks. I tried to understand his world as best I could, and our encounter revealed to me a concept confirmed by later encounters, that the outflow from Russia of a significant part of her spiritual forces, which occurred in the Civil War, had deprived us of a great and important stream of Russian culture. Everyone who really loves that culture will strive for the reunion of both streams, the one at home and the tributary abroad. Only then will our culture attain wholeness. Only then will it reveal its capacity for benign development. And I dream of living until that day. A human being is weak. Weak. In the end, that spring, even the most stubborn of us wanted forgiveness and were ready to give up a lot for just a little bit more life. An anecdote was current among us. "What is your last word, accused?" "I beg you to send me wherever you please, just as long as it is under the Soviet government and the sun is there." No one was threatening to deprive us of the Soviet government, of course, just of the sun. No one wanted to be sent beyond the Arctic Circle to scurvy and malnutrition. For some reason, a legend about the Altai region in particular flourished in the cells. Those rare persons who had been there at one time or another, but especially those who had never been there, wove melodious dreams about the wonderful country of the Altai for their cellmates. It had the vast expanses of Siberia and a mild climate, rivers of honey flowing between banks of wheat, the steppe and mountains, herds of sheep, flocks of wildfowl, shoals of fish, populous, rich villages. Does not the prisoner's dream of the Altai simply continue the old peasant dream about it? The so-called lands of His Majesty's cabinet were in the Altai, and because of this the area was closed to colonization much longer than the rest of Siberia. But it was there that the peasants wanted most of all to settle, and where they actually settled. Is it not from this that the enduring legend has arisen? Oh, if only we could find a hiding place in that quiet, if only we could listen to the pure resounding of the cock crow in the unpolluted air, or stroke the good, serious face of a horse. Curses on you, all you great problems. Let someone else beat his head against you, someone more stupid. Oh, just to rest there from the interrogator's mother oaths and the monotonous unwinding of your whole life, from the crash of the prison locks, from the suffocating stuffiness of the cell. Only one life is allotted us, one small, short life, and we had been criminal enough to push ours in front of somebody's machine guns, or drag it with us, still unsullied, into the dirty rubbish heap of politics. There, in the Altai, it appeared, one could live in the lowest, darkest hut on the edge of the village next to the forest, and one could go into the woods, not for brushwood and not for mushrooms, but just to go for no reason and hug 2 tree trunks. Dear ones, you're all I need. And the spring itself sounded a summons to mercy. It was the spring that marked the ending of such an enormous war. We saw that millions of us prisoners were flowing past, and knew that millions more would greet us in the camps. It just couldn't be that so many people were to remain in prison after the greatest victory in the world. It was just to frighten us that they were holding us for the time being, so that we might remember and take heed. Of course, there would soon be a total amnesty, and all of us would be released. Someone even swore that he had read in a newspaper that Stalin, replying to some American correspondent, whose name I cannot remember, said that after the war there would be an amnesty the like of which the world had never seen, and one of the interrogators had actually said to someone else that there would soon be a general amnesty. These rumors were a help to the interrogators because they weakened the prisoner's will. The hell with him, let's sign, it isn't going to be for long anyway. But for mercy, one must have wisdom. This has been a truth throughout our history, and will remain one for a long time to come. We did not heed the few sober minds among us who croaked out that never, in a whole quarter-century, had there been an amnesty for political prisoners, and that there never would be one. Some cell expert among the stool pigeons leapt up with an answer. Yes, there was, in 1927, for the 10th anniversary of the Revolution. All the prisons were emptied, and white flags were flown on all of them. This astonishing vision of white flags on the prisons, why white, was particularly striking. Wyszynski presents the figures. In the 1927 amnesty, 7.3% of the prisoners were amnestied. This is a credible figure, pretty poor for a 10th anniversary. Among the political prisoners, women with children were freed, and those who had only a few months left to serve. In the Verkhne-Uralsk prison isolator, for example, 12 out of the 200 prisoners there were released. But in the middle of it, they regretted even this wretched amnesty and began to block it. They delayed some releases, and some people who were freed were given a minus restriction instead of full freedom to go where they pleased. We brushed aside those wise individuals among us who explained that millions of us were imprisoned precisely because the war had ended. We were no longer needed at the front. We were dangerous in the rear, and were it not for us, not one brick would ever get laid at the remote construction projects. We were too self-absorbed even to grasp Stalin's simple economic calculations, let alone his malice. Just who this year, after being demobilized, would want to leave his family and home and go off to the Kolyma, to Vorkuta, to Siberia, where there were neither roads nor houses? It was virtually the job of the State Planning Commission to assign to the MVD the number of workers required for plan fulfillment, and thus the number to be arrested. An amnesty, a broad and generous amnesty, was what we waited for and thirsted for. Somebody said that in England prisoners were amnestied on the anniversary of the coronation. In other words, every year. Many politicals had been amnestied on the 300th anniversary of the Romanovs in 1912. Could it really be possible that now, after we had won a victory which would resound throughout our entire era and even longer, the Stalin government would be petty and vengeful, and would hang on to its resentment of every stumble and slip of each of its minuscule subjects? There is a simple truth which one can learn only through suffering. In war, not victories are blessed, but defeats. Governments need victories, and the people need defeats. Victory gives rise to the desire for more victories, but after a defeat it is freedom that men desire and usually attain. A people needs defeat, just as an individual needs suffering and misfortune. They compel a deepening of the inner life and generate a spiritual upsurge. The Poltava victory was a great misfortune for Russia. It resulted in 2 centuries of great strain and stress, ruin, the absence of freedom, and war again. The Poltava victory spelled salvation for the Swedes. Having lost the appetite for war, the Swedes became the most prosperous and the freest people in Europe. Perhaps only in the 20th century, if one is to believe the stories one hears, has their stagnating well-being led to moral indigestion. We are so used to taking pride in our victory over Napoleon that we leave out of account the fact that because of it, the emancipation of the serfs did not take place a half-century sooner. Because of it, the strengthened monarchy destroyed the Decembrists. The French occupation was never a reality for Russia. But the Crimean War and the Japanese War and our war with Germany in the First World War, all those defeats brought us freedom and revolution. We believed in amnesty that spring. We weren't being at all original in this. Talking with old prisoners, one gradually discovers that this thirst for mercy and this faith in mercy is never absent within grey prison walls. For decades and decades, wave after wave of prisoners has thirsted for and believed in either an amnesty or a new code or a general review of cases. And the rumors about these things have always been supported by the organs with skilled caution. The prisoner's imagination sees the ardently awaited arrival of the Angel of Liberation in just about anything. The next anniversary of the October Revolution, Lenin's anniversaries, Victory Day, Red Army Day, Paris Commune Day, every new session of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee, the VTSIK, the end of every 5-year plan, every plenary session of the Supreme Court. And the wilder the arrests, the more Homeric and mind-boggling the scale of the waves of prisoners, the more they inspired not sober-mindedness, but faith in amnesty. All sources of light can to some degree be compared with the sun, and the sun cannot be compared with anything. So it is that all the expectations in the world can be compared with the expectation of amnesty, but the expectation of amnesty cannot be compared with anything else. In the spring of 1945, every newcomer to the cell was asked first of all what he had heard about an amnesty, and if 2 or 3 prisoners were taken from their cells with their things, the cell experts immediately compared cases and drew the conclusion that theirs were the least serious cases, and they had clearly been taken out to be released. It had begun. In the toilet and in the baths, the prisoners' post offices, our activists looked everywhere for signs and graffiti about the amnesty. And one day at the beginning of July, in the famous lavender vestibule of the Butyrki baths, we read the enormous prophecy written in soap on a glazed lavender slab far higher than a man's head, which meant that one man had stood on another's shoulders in order to write it in a place where it would take longer to erase. Hurrah! Amnesty on July the 17th! Indeed, the bastards were wrong by only 1 digit. For more details on the great Stalin amnesty of July the 7th, 1945, see Part 3, Chapter 6. What a celebration went on. After all, if they hadn't known for sure, they wouldn't have written it. Everything that beat, pulsed, circulated in the body came to a stop beneath the wave of happiness, the expectation that the doors were about to swing open. But for mercy, one must have wisdom. In the middle of July, the corridor jailer sent one old man from our cell to wash down the toilet, and while they were there, eye to eye, for he wouldn't have dared in the presence of witnesses, he looked sympathetically at the prisoner's grey head and asked, "What's your article, Father?" 58. The old man lit up. At home, 3 generations were mourning his arrest. "You're not included," sighed the jailer. Nonsense, we decided in the cell. Just an illiterate jailer. There was also a young man from Kiev in the cell, Valentin. I can't remember his family name. He had big eyes that were beautiful in a feminine way, and he was terrified by the interrogation. There is no doubt that he had the gift of precognition, perhaps only in his then current state of excitement. More than once he went around the cell in the morning and pointed. "Today they are going to come for you and you. I saw it in my dream. And they came and got them." The very individuals he had pointed out. One might add that a prisoner's heart is so inclined toward mysticism that he accepts precognition almost without surprise. On July the 27th, Valentin came up to me. "Alexander, today it is our turn." And he told me a dream that had all the characteristics of prison dreams. A bridge across a muddy stream. A cross. I began to get my things together, and it was not for nothing either. He and I were summoned after morning tea. Our cellmates saw us off with noisy good wishes, and many of them assured us we were going off to freedom. They had figured it out by comparing our less serious cases. Perhaps you honestly don't believe it. Perhaps you won't allow yourself to believe. You can try to brush it aside with jokes. But flaming pincers, hotter than anything else on earth, suddenly close around your heart. They just do. Suppose it's true. They assembled 20 of us from various cells and took us to the baths first. Before every big change in his life, the prisoner has first of all to take a bath. We had time enough there, an hour and a half, to exchange our hunches and ideas. At that point, all steamed up, our skins tender. We were taken through the little emerald park in the Butyrka's interior courtyard, where the birds sang deafeningly, although they were probably only sparrows, and the green of the trees seemed unbearably bright to eyes no longer used to it. Never had my eyes seen the green of the leaves with such intensity as they did that spring, and never in my life had I seen anything closer to God's paradise than that little Butyrki park, which never took more than 30 seconds to cross on the asphalt path. Many years later, this time as a tourist, I saw another similar park, except that it was even smaller, in the Trubetskoy bastion of the Peter and Paul fortress in Leningrad. The other tourists exclaimed over the darkness of the corridors and cells, but I kept thinking to myself that with such a park to walk in, the prisoners of the Trubetskoy bastion were not lost men. We were taken out to walk only in deathly, cell-like stone enclosures. They took us to the Butyrki station, a very well-chosen nickname for that reception and dispatch point, especially because its main hall was really like a good railroad station. They pushed us into a large, spacious box. It was half dark inside, and the air was clean and fresh, since its one and only little window was very high up and had no muzzle, and it opened on that same sunny little park, and through the transom the birds' twitter deafened us, and in the opening a little bright green twig hung, promising us all freedom and home. We had never been in prison in such a good box, and that couldn't be a matter of chance. And we were all cases for the OSOs, the special boards attached to the GPU-NKVD, and it turned out that each of us had been imprisoned for nothing much. No one touched us for 3 hours, no one opened the doors. We paced up and down the box, and finally, tired out, we sat down on the slab benches. And the little twig kept bobbing and bobbing outside the opening, and the sparrows screamed as if they were possessed. Suddenly the door crashed open, and one of us was summoned, a quiet bookkeeper, 35 years old. He went out. The door was locked. We started running about our box even more agitatedly than before. We were on hot coals. Once more the crash of the door. They called another one out and readmitted the first. We rushed to him. But he was not the same man. The life had gone out of his face. His wide-open eyes were unseeing. His movements were uncertain as he stumbled across the smooth floor of the box. Was he in a state of shock? Had they swatted him with an ironing board? Well, we asked him with sinking hearts. If he had not, in fact, just gotten up from the electric chair, he must at the very least have been given a death sentence. And in the voice of one reporting the end of the universe, the bookkeeper managed to blurt out, 5 years. And once more the door crashed. That was how quickly they returned, as if they were only being taken to the toilet to urinate. The second man returned, all aglow. Evidently he was being released. Well, come on. We swarmed around him, our hopes rising again. He waved his hand, choking with laughter. 15 years! It was just too absurd to be believed.
This concludes the reading of Section 1 of the Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1. This book was read by Frederick Davidson. If you would like to receive a free catalogue listing our complete line of audiobooks, write us at Post Box 969, Ashland, Oregon, zip code 97520, or call toll-free 1-800-SAY-BOOK. That's 1-800-729-2665. Will you please wind or rewind the tape as appropriate, so as to present the book in order for the next person to enjoy? Thank you. Gulag Archipelago, 1918 to 1956. An experiment in literary investigation by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Translated by Thomas P. Whitney. Copyright 1973 by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. English language translation, copyright 1973-1974 by Harper & Row Publishers, Incorporated. This recording of the reading of the Gulag Archipelago was published by arrangement with Harper & Row Publishers, Incorporated, and was produced in 1989 by Blackstone Audiobooks, which holds the copyright thereto. Neither this recording nor any part thereof may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authority from Blackstone Audiobooks Incorporated. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1. This volume is 615 pages long and contains 2 parts. The Prison Industry, which consists of 12 chapters, and Perpetual Motion, which consists of 4 chapters. The volume is read in 2 sections. The first took us through Chapter 6 of The Prison Industry. The second picks up with Chapter 7 and takes us to the end of Volume 1. And now, the Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1, Section 2.
Chapter 7. In the Engine Room. The box adjacent to the so-called Butyrki station was the famous frisking box when new arrivals were searched. It had space enough for 5 or 6 jailers to process up to 20 zeks in one batch. Now, however, it was empty, and the rough-hewn search tables had nothing on them. Over at one side of the room, seated behind a small nondescript table beneath a small lamp, was a neat, black-haired NKVD major. Patient boredom was what his face chiefly revealed. The intervals during which the zeks were brought in and led out one by one were a waste of his time. Their signatures could have been collected much, much faster. He indicated that I was to sit down on the stool opposite him, on the other side of his table. He asked my name. To the right and left of the inkwell lay 2 piles of white papers the size of a half-sheet of typewriter paper, all looking much the same. In format, they were just like the fuel requisitions handed out in apartment house management offices or warrants in official institutions for purchase of office supplies. Leafing through the pile on the right, the Major found the paper which referred to me. He pulled it out and read it aloud to me in a bored patter. I understood I had been sentenced to 8 years. Immediately he began to write a statement on the back of it with a fountain pen to the effect that the text had been read to me on the particular date. My heart didn't give an extra half-beat. It was all so everyday and routine. Could this really be my sentence, the turning point in my life? I would have liked to feel nervous to experience this moment to the full, but I just couldn't. And the Major had already pushed a sheet over to me, the blank side facing up, and a schoolchild's 7-kopeck pen with a bad point that had lint on it from the inkwell lay there in front of me. No, I have to read it myself. Do you really think I would deceive you? The Major objected lazily. Well, go ahead, read it. Unwillingly, he let the paper out of his hand. I turned it over and began to look through it with deliberate slowness, not just word by word, but letter by letter. It had been typed, but what I had in front of me was not the original, but a carbon. Extract from a decree of the OSO of the NKVD of the USSR of July the 7th, 1945, number blank. They had meant to sentence me on the very day of the amnesty. The work must go on. All of this was underscored with a dotted line, and the sheet was vertically divided with a dotted line. Case heard, on the left-hand side of the dotted line. Accusation of so-and-so, name, year of birth, place of birth. On the right-hand side of the dotted line, decreed. To designate for so-and-so, name, for anti-Soviet propaganda, and for an attempt to create an anti-Soviet organization, 8 years in corrective labor camps. Copy verified, secretary, and then his name. Was I really just supposed to sign and leave in silence? I looked at the Major to see whether he intended to say something to me, whether he might not provide some clarification. No, he had no such intention. He had already nodded to the jailer at the door to get the next prisoner ready. To give the moment at least a little importance, I asked him with a tragic expression, "But really, this is terrible. 8 years? What for?" And I could hear how false my own words sounded. Neither he nor I detected anything terrible. "Right there." The Major showed me once again where to sign. I signed, I could simply not think of anything else to do. "In that case, allow me to write an appeal right here. After all, the sentence is unjust." "As provided by regulations," the Major assented with a nod, placing my sheet of paper on the left-hand pile. "Let's move along," commanded the jailer. And I moved along. I had not really shown much initiative. Georgi Tenno, who to be sure had been handed a paper worth 25 years, answered, "After all, this is a life sentence. In olden times they used to beat the drums and assemble a crowd when a person was given a life sentence, and here it's like being on a list for a soap ration. 25 years and run along." Arnold Rappaport took the pen and wrote on the back of the verdict, "I protest categorically this terroristic illegal sentence and demand immediate release." The officer who had handed it to him had at first waited patiently, but when he read what Rappaport had written, he was enraged and tore up the paper with the note on it. So what? The term remained in force anyway. This was just a copy. Vera Koryeva was expecting 15 years, and she saw with delight that there was a typo on the official sheet. It read only 5. She laughed her luminous laugh and hurried to sign before they took it back. The officer looked at her dubiously. "Do you really understand what I read to you?" Yes, thank you very much. 5 years in corrective labor camps." The 10-year sentence of Janos Rojas, a Hungarian, was read to him in the corridor in Russian without any translation. He signed it, not knowing it was his sentence, and he waited a long time afterward for his trial. Still later, when he was in camp, he recalled the incident very vaguely and realized what had happened. I returned to the box with a smile. It was strange. Each minute I became jollier and more relieved. Everyone was returning with 10-ruble bills, including Valentin. The lightest term in our group that day had been given the bookkeeper who had gone out of his mind. He was still, in fact, beside himself. And the lightest term after his was mine. In the splashes of sun and the July breeze, the little twig outside the window continued to bob up and down as gaily as before. We chattered boisterously. Here and there, more and more frequently, laughter resounded in the box. We were laughing because everything had gone off so smoothly. We were laughing at the shocked bookkeeper. We were laughing at our morning hopes and at the way our cellmates had seen us off and arranged secret signals with us to be transmitted via food parcels. 4 potatoes or 2 bagels. "Well, anyway, there is going to be an amnesty," several affirmed. "All this is just for form's sake, and it doesn't mean anything. They want to give us a good scare, so we'll keep in line. Stalin told an American correspondent—" "What was his name?" "I don't remember his name." So they ordered us to take our things, formed us up by twos, and led us once again through that same marvelous little park filled with summer. And where did they take us? Once again, to the baths. And oh, what a peal of laughter that got. My God, what silly nincompoops. Still roaring, we undressed, hung our duds on the same trolley hooks, and rolled them into the same roaster they'd already been rolled into that very morning. Roaring, each of us took a small sliver of repulsive soap, and went into the spacious, resonant shower-room to wash off our girlish gaiety. We splashed about in there, pouring hot, clean water on ourselves, and we got to romping about as if we were school kids who had come to the baths after their last exam. This cleansing, relieving laughter was, I think, not really sick, but a living defense for the salvation of the organism. As we dried ourselves off, Valentin said to me reassuringly, intimately, "Well, all right, we're still young. We're going to live a long time yet. The main thing is not to make a misstep now. We are going to a camp, and will not say one word to anyone so they won't plaster new terms on us. We will work honestly, and keep our mouths shut." And he really believed in his program, that naive little kernel of grain caught between Stalin's millstones. He really had his hopes set on it. One wanted to agree with him, to serve out the term cosily, and then expunge from one's head what one had lived through. But I had begun to sense a truth inside myself. If, in order to live, it is necessary not to live, then what's it all for? One cannot really say that the OSO had been conceived after the revolution. Catherine the Great had sentenced the journalist Novikov, whom she disliked, to 15 years on, one might say, an OSO basis, since she didn't turn him over to a court. And all the Tsars, once in a while, in a fatherly way, exiled without any trial those who had incurred their displeasure. In the 1860s, a basic court reform took place. It seemed as if rulers and subjects had both begun to develop something like a juridical view of society. And yet in the 70s and 80s, Korolenko tracked down cases where administrative repression had usurped the role of judicial judgment. In 1872, he himself and 2 other students were exiled without trial on the orders of the Deputy Minister of State Properties, a typical case of an OSO. Another time, he and his brother were exiled without trial to Glazov. Korolenko has also given us the name of one Fyodor Bogdan, an emissary from the peasants, a Khodok, who got right up to the Tsar himself and was then exiled. And of Pyankov, too, who was acquitted by a court and yet exiled by order of the Tsar. And there were several others as well. And Vera Zasulich explained in a letter sent after she emigrated that she had not run away from the court and a trial, but from non-judicial administrative repression. Thus, the tradition of the dotted line, the administratively issued sentence, dragged on. But it was too lax. It was suitable for a drowsy Asiatic country, but not for a country that was rapidly advancing. Moreover, it lacked any definite identity. Who was the OSO? Sometimes it was the Tsar, sometimes the governor, sometimes the deputy minister. And if it was still possible to enumerate names and cases, this was not, begging your pardon, real scope. Real scope entered the picture with the 20s, when permanently operating troikas, panels of 3 operating behind closed doors, were created to bypass the courts permanently. In the beginning they even flaunted it proudly, the troika of the GPU. Not only did they not conceal the names of the members, they publicized them. Who on the Solovetsky Islands did not know the names of the famous Moscow troika, Gleb Boki, Vul, and Vasiliev? Yes, and what a word it was, in fact, troika. It bore a slight hint of sleigh bells on the shaft bow, the celebration of Shrovetide, and interwoven with all this a mystery. Why, troika? What did it mean? After all, a court wasn't a quartet either. And a troika wasn't a court, and the biggest mystery of all lay in the fact that it was kept out of sight. We hadn't been there, we hadn't seen it. All we got was a piece of paper. Sign here. The troika was even more frightening than a revolutionary tribunal. It set itself even farther apart, muffled itself up, locked itself in a separate room, and, soon, concealed the names of its members. Thus we grew used to the idea that the troika members didn't eat or drink or move about among ordinary people. Once they had isolated themselves in order to go into session, they were shut off for good, and all we knew of them were the sentences handed out through typists. And they had to be returned, too. Such documents couldn't be left in the hands of individuals. These troikas, we use the plural just in case, because, as with a deity, we never know where or in what form it exists, satisfied a persistent need that had arisen, never to allow those arrested to return to freedom. This was like an OTK, a Department for Quality Control in Industry, but in this case it was attached to the GPU to prevent any spoiled goods. If it turned out that someone was innocent and could therefore not be tried at all, then let him have his -32 via the troika, which meant he couldn't live in any of the provincial capitals, or let him spend 2 or 3 years in exile, after which he would have a convict's clipped ear, would always be a marked man, and from then on a recidivist. Please forgive us, reader, we have once more gone astray with this rightist opportunism, this concept of guilt, and of the guilty or innocent. It has, after all, been explained to us that the heart of the matter is not personal guilt, but social danger. One can imprison an innocent person if he is socially hostile, and one can release a guilty man if he is socially friendly. But, lacking legal training, we can be forgiven, for the 1926 Code, according to which, my good fellow, we lived for 25 years and more, was itself criticized for an impermissible bourgeois approach, for an insufficiently class-conscious approach, and for some kind of bourgeois weighing of punishments in relation to the gravity of what had been committed. Alas, it is not for us to write the absorbing history of this particular organ, how the troikas turned into OSOs, or when they got renamed, or whether there were OSOs in provincial centres, or just one of them in the Great Palace, or which of our great and proud leaders were members, or how often they met and how long their sessions lasted, whether or not they were served tea while they worked, and if they were, what was served with the tea, and how the work itself proceeded. Did they converse while it was going on or not? We are not the ones who will write this history because we don't know. All that we have heard is that the essence of the OSO was triune, and even though it is still impossible to name its industrious members, yet we do know the three organs permanently represented there. One member represented the Central Committee of the party, one the MVD, and one the Chief Prosecutor's Office. However, it would not be a miracle if we should learn some day that there were never any sessions, and that there was only a staff of experienced typists composing extracts from non-existent records of proceedings, and one general administrator who directed the typists. As for typists, there were certainly typists, that we can guarantee. Up to 1924, the authority of the Troika was limited to sentences of 3 years maximum. From 1924 on, they moved up to 5 years of camp. From 1937 on, the OSO could turn out 10-ruble bills. After 1948, they could rivet a quarter, 25 years, on you. And there are people, Chavdarov, for example, who know that during the war years the OSO even sentenced prisoners to execution by shooting. Nothing unusual about this. The OSO was nowhere mentioned in either the Constitution or the Code. However, it turned out to be the most convenient kind of hamburger machine, easy to operate, undemanding, and requiring no legal lubrication. The Code existed on its own, and the OSO existed on its own, and it kept on deftly grinding without all the Code's 205 articles, neither invoking them nor even mentioning them. As they used to joke in camp, there is no court for nothing. For that, there is no OSO. Of course, the OSO itself also needed for convenience some kind of operational shorthand, but for that purpose it worked out on its own a dozen letter articles which made operations very much simpler. It wasn't necessary, when they were used, to cudgel your brains trying to make things fit the formulations of the Code, and they were few enough to be easily remembered by a child. Some of them we have already described: ASA, anti-Soviet agitation; KRD, counter-revolutionary activity; KRTD, counter-revolutionary Trotskyite activity, and that T made the life of a Zek in camp much harder; PSH, suspicion of espionage. Espionage that went beyond the bounds of suspicion was handed over to tribunal. SVP-SH, contacts leading to suspicion of espionage. KRM, counter-revolutionary thought. VAS, dissemination of anti-Soviet sentiments. SOE, socially dangerous element. SVE, socially harmful element. PD, criminal activity, a favorite accusation against former camp inmates if there was nothing else to be used against them. And then, finally, there was the very expansive category. CHS, member of a family, of a person convicted under one of the foregoing letter categories. It has to be remembered that these categories were not applied uniformly and equally among different groups and in different years, but, as with the articles of the Code and the sections in special decrees, they broke out in sudden epidemics. There is one more qualification. The OSO did not claim to be handing down a sentence. It did not sentence a person, but instead imposed an administrative penalty. And that was the whole thing in a nutshell. Therefore it was, of course, natural for it to have juridical independence. But even though they did not claim that the administrative penalty was a court sentence, It could be up to 25 years and include deprivation of titles, ranks, and decorations, confiscation of all property, imprisonment, deprivation of the right to correspond. Thus a person could disappear from the face of the earth with the help of the OSO even more reliably than under the terms of some primitive court sentence. The OSO enjoyed another important advantage in that its penalty could not be appealed. There was nowhere to appeal to. There was no appeals jurisdiction above it, and no jurisdiction beneath it. It was subordinate only to the Minister of Internal Affairs, to Stalin, and to Satan. Another big advantage the OSO had was speed. This speed was limited only by the technology of typewriting. And last but not least, not only did the OSO not have to confront the accused face-to-face, which lessened the burden on inter-prison transport, it didn't even have to have his photograph. At a time when the prisons were badly overcrowded, this was a great additional advantage, because the prisoner did not have to take up space on the prison floor or eat free bread once his interrogation had been completed. He could be sent off to camp immediately and put to honest work. The copy of the sentence could be read to him much later. It used to be that in favorable conditions the prisoners were unloaded from freight cars at their destinations, and they were made to kneel down right there, next to the tracks, as a precaution against attempted escape. But it looked as if they were praying to the OSO, and then and there their sentences were read out to them. It could also happen differently. In 1938, those who arrived at Peribori on prisoner transports did not know either their code articles or their sentences, but the clerk who met them knew, and he looked them up on the list. SVE, socially harmful element, 5 years. That was during the time when there was an urgent need for many hands to work on the Moscow-Volga Canal. Others worked in the camps for months without knowing their sentences. After this, as I. Dobryak reported, they were solemnly lined up, and not just on any old day, but on May the 1st, 1938, when the red flags were flying, and the Stalino province troika's sentences were announced. This would indicate that the OSO did get decentralized in times of heavy load. These sentences were from 10 to 20 years apiece, and in that same year my former camp foreman, Sinebriokov, was sent off with a whole trainload of unsentenced prisoners from Chelyabinsk to Cherepovets. Months passed, and the Zeks worked away, and then one rest day in winter. Note the days, another advantage of the OSO. When the frost was cracking, they were driven out into the courtyard and lined up. A newly arrived lieutenant appeared and introduced himself as having come to inform them of their OSO penalties. But he turned out to be a decent sort, because he squinted at their thin footwear and at the sun's rays in the steaming frost and said, "Well, anyway, men, why should you freeze out here? The OSO gave you all 10 years apiece. There are just a very, very few who got 8. You understand? Disperse." But in view of the frankly mechanical operation of the Special Board, why have any courts at all? Why use a horse car when there's a noiseless modern streetcar available, which no one can jump out of? Is it a matter of keeping the judges well fed? Still, it is really quite indecent for a democratic state not to have courts. In 1919, the 8th Congress of the party proclaimed in its program, "Efforts must be made to involve all the working population in the exercise of judicial duties." It did not prove possible to involve all the working population. Conducting a trial is a delicate business, but there was no question of getting along entirely without courts. However, our political courts, the special collegia of provincial courts, the military tribunals, and why, actually, should there be military tribunals in peacetime anyway? And all the Supreme Courts, too, unanimously followed the path of the OSO. They, too, did not get stuck in the mud of public trials or in arguments between sides. Their primary and principal distinguishing feature was closed doors. They were, first of all, closed courts, for their own convenience. And by now we have become so accustomed to the fact that millions and millions of people were tried in closed sessions, and have become used to this for so long that now and then some mixed-up son, brother, or nephew of a prisoner will even snort at you with conviction. "And what would you have wanted? There's information here. Our enemies will find out. You can't do it."
Thus the fear that our enemies will find out makes us clamp our head between our own knees. Who, in our fatherland, except some bookworms, remembers now that Karakodzov, who fired at the Tsar, was provided with a defense lawyer? Or that Zhelyabov and all the Narodnaya Volya group were tried in public without any fear that the Turks would find out? Or that Vera Zasulich, who attempted to kill the official who was, translated in Soviet terms, the chief of the Moscow administration of the MVD, although she missed, and the bullet went past his head, not only was not destroyed in a torture chamber, but was acquitted in open court by a jury, no troika, and then went off in triumph in a carriage. Despite these comparisons, I do not at all mean to say that a perfect system of courts and justice ever existed in Russia. In all probability, an excellent judicial system is the last fruit of the most mature society, or else one needs a Solomon. Vladimir Dahl notes that in the period before the emancipation of the serfs, Russia had not one single proverb containing any praise of the courts. And that really means something. It seems likely that they never had time to get around to making up a proverb praising the Zemstvo chiefs either. But, nevertheless, the judicial reform of 1864 at least set the urban sector of our society on the road toward those English models which Herzen praised so highly. Saying all this, I still have not forgotten what Dostoevsky had to say in his Diary of a Writer against our trials by jury, about the excesses of some lawyers' eloquence. Gentlemen of the jury, what kind of woman would she have been if she had not stabbed her rival? Gentlemen of the jury, who among you would not have thrown the child out of the window? And the risk that a juror's momentary impulse might outweigh his civic responsibility. But spiritually, Dostoevsky far outstripped the realities of our life, and he worried about what he shouldn't have worried about. He believed that we had achieved open trials once and for all. Indeed, who among his contemporaries could have believed in the OSO? And somewhere else he writes, "It is better to err on the side of mercy than on that of the death penalty." Oh, yes, yes, yes. Excesses of eloquence do not afflict exclusively a judicial system in process of being established. Even more conspicuously, they afflict an already established democracy that has not yet discovered its moral goals. England again gives us examples, as when, for partisan advantage, the leader of the opposition does not hesitate to blame the government for a national predicament worse than actually exists. Excesses of eloquence are a malady, but what word can we then use for the excessive use of closed doors? Dostoevsky dreamed of a court in which everything essential to the defense of the accused would be set forth by the prosecutor. How many eons will we have to wait for that? Our social experience has so far enriched us immeasurably with defense lawyers who accuse the defendant. As an honest Soviet person, as a true patriot, I cannot but feel repugnance at the disclosure of these evil deeds. And how comfortable it all is for the judges in a closed session. Judicial robes are not required, and one can even roll up one's sleeves. How easy it is to work. There are no public address systems, no newspaper men, and no public. Well, there is a public, an audience, but it consists of interrogators. For example, they used to attend the Leningrad province court during the day to find out how their protégés were conducting themselves, and at night went calling on those prisoners who needed to have their consciences appealed to. C.H. N's group. The second main characteristic of our political courts is the lack of ambiguity in their work, which is to say, predetermined verdicts. That same collection, edited by A.Y. Vyshinsky, includes materials indicating that the predetermination of verdicts is an old story. In 1924 to 1929, sentences were determined by joint administrative and economic considerations. Beginning in 1924, because of national unemployment, the courts reduced the number of verdicts which sentenced prisoners to corrective labor while they continued to live at home, and increased short-term prison sentences. These cases involved only non-political offenders, of course. As a result, prisons were overcrowded with short-termers serving sentences of up to 6 months, and not enough use was being made of them in labor colonies. At the beginning of 1929, the People's Commissariat of Justice of the USSR, in Circular Number 5, condemned short-term sentences, and on November the 6th, 1929, the eve of the 12th anniversary of the October Revolution, when the country was supposedly entering on the construction of socialism, a decree of the Central Executive Committee and the Council of People's Commissars simply forbade all sentences of less than 1 year. In other words, you, a judge, always know what the higher-ups expect of you. Furthermore, there's a telephone if you still have any doubts. And following the example of the OSOs, sentences might even be typed out ahead of time, with only the prisoner's name to be added later by hand. And in 1942, Strakovich cried out during a session of the military tribunal of the Leningrad military district, "But I could not have been recruited by Ignatovsky when I was only 10 years old." But the presiding judge barked back, "Don't slander the Soviet intelligence service." The whole thing had been predetermined long before. Each and every one of the Ignatovsky group was to be sentenced to be shot. Some man named Lipov got included in the group, but no one from the group knew him, and he knew none of them either. Well, so, all right, Lipov got 10 years. How hugely the predetermination of sentences contributed to easing the thorny life of a judge. It wasn't so much a mental relief, in the sense that one didn't have to think, as it was a moral relief. You didn't have to torture yourself with worry that you might make a mistake in a sentence and make orphans out of your own little children. And the predetermination of sentences could dispose even so immovable a judge as Ulrich to good humor. And what major execution had he not pronounced? In 1945, the military collegium was hearing the case of the Estonian separatists. Short, stocky, good-humored Ulrich was presiding. He didn't pass up a single opportunity to joke not only with his colleagues but also with the prisoners. After all, that's what humaneness is, a new trait. Where had it ever been seen? Having learned that Susi was a lawyer, he said to him with a smile, "Well, so now your profession can be of some use to you." Well, there is no need to quarrel. Why be embittered? The court routine proceeded pleasantly. They smoked right at the judge's table, and at a convenient moment broke off for a good lunch. And when evening began to fall, they had to go and confer. But who confers at night? They left the prisoners to sit at their desks all night long and went on home. At 9 in the morning they came in, all brisk and freshly shaved. "Rise, the court is in session." And all the prisoners were given a 10-ruble bill apiece. And if anyone should object that the OSO at least proceeded without hypocrisy, whereas there was hypocrisy in instances like the above, they pretended to be conferring, but didn't really confer. We would certainly have to enter a strong, very strong dissent. Well, the third and final characteristic is dialectics, which used to be crudely described in the folk saying, "Whichever way you point a wagon tongue, that's the way it goes." The code cannot be a dead weight in the path of the judge. The articles of the code had been around during 10, 15, 20 years of rapid change, and just as Faust said, "The whole world changes and everything moves forward, and why should I be afraid to break my word?" All the articles of the code had become encrusted with interpretations, directions, instructions, and if the actions of the accused are not covered by the code, he can still be convicted. By analogy, what opportunities? Simply because of origins, 735, belonging to a socially dangerous milieu. In the Republic of South Africa, terror has gone to such lengths in recent years that every suspicious SDE, socially dangerous element, black, can be arrested and held for 3 months without investigation or trial. Anyone can see immediately the flimsiness of this. Why not from 3 to 10 years? For contact with dangerous persons. This is something we hadn't known, something the newspaper Izvestia told us in July 1957. Here's scope for you. Who is dangerous, and what contacts consist of only the judge can say. But one should not complain about the precise wording of our published laws either. On January the 13th, 1950, a decree was issued re-establishing capital punishment. One is bound, of course, to consider that capital punishment never did depart from Berrier's cellars. And the decree stated that the death sentence could be imposed on subversives, diversionists. What did that mean? It didn't say. Iosif Vissarionovitch loved it that way. Not to say all of it, just to hint. Did it refer only to someone who blew up rails with TNT? It didn't say. We had long since come to know what a diversionist was. Someone who produced goods of poor quality was a diversionist. But what was a subversive? Was someone subverting the authority of the government, for example, in a conversation on a streetcar? Or if a girl married a foreigner, wasn't she subverting the majesty of our motherland? But it is not the judge who judges. The judge only takes his pay. The directives did the judging. The directive of 1937, 10 years, 20 years, execution by shooting. The directive of 1943, 20 years at hard labor, hanging. The directive of 1945, 10 years for everyone, plus 5 of disenfranchisement, manpower for 3 5-year plans. Babayev, in fact a non-political, shouted at them, "You can muzzle me for 300 years, but I'll never lift my hand for you, you benefactors." The directive of 1949, everyone gets 25. Thus it was that a real spy, Schultz in Berlin in 1948, could get 10 years, and someone who had never been a spy, Günther Waschkau, got 25, because he was in the wave of 1949. The machine stamped out the sentences. The prisoner had already been deprived of all right when they cut off his buttons on the threshold of state security, and he couldn't avoid a stretch. The members of the legal profession were so used to this that they fell on their faces in 1958 and caused a big scandal. The text of the projected new Fundamental Principles of Criminal Prosecution of the USSR was published in the newspapers, and they'd forgotten to include any reference to possible grounds for acquittal. The government newspaper issued a mild rebuke. The impression might be created that our courts only bring in convictions. Izvestia, September the 10th, 1958. But just take the jurist's side for a moment. Why, in fact, should a trial be supposed to have 2 possible outcomes when our general elections are conducted on the basis of 1 candidate? An acquittal is, in fact, unthinkable from the economic point of view. It would mean that the informers, the security officers, the interrogators, the prosecutor's staff, the internal guard in the prison, and the convoy had all worked to no purpose. Here is one straightforward and typical case that was brought before a military tribunal. In 1941, the security operations branch of our inactive army stationed in Mongolia was called on to show its activity and vigilance. The military medical assistant, Lozovsky, who was jealous of Lieutenant Pavel Chulpenyev because of some woman, realized this. He addressed 3 questions to Chulpenyev when they were alone. 1. Why, in your opinion, are we retreating from the Germans? Chulpenyev's reply. They have more equipment, and they were mobilized earlier. Lozovsky's counter. No, it's a maneuver. We're decoying them. 2. Do you believe the Allies will help? Chulpenyev. I believe they'll help, but not from unselfish motives. Lozovsky's counter. They are deceiving us. They won't help us at all. 3. Why was Voroshilov sent to command the Northwest Front? Chulpenyev answered and forgot about them, and Lozovsky wrote a denunciation. Chulpenyev was summoned before the political branch of the division and expelled from the Komsomol for a defeatist attitude, for praising German equipment, for belittling the strategy of our high command. The loudest voice raised against him belonged to the Komsomol organizer Kalyagin, who had behaved like a coward at the Battle of Kalchin Gol in Chulpenyev's presence, and therefore found it convenient to get rid of the witness once and for all. Chulpenyev's arrest followed. He had one confrontation with Lozovsky. Their previous conversation was not even brought up by the interrogator. One question was asked. Do you know this man? Yes. Witness, you may leave. The interrogator was afraid the charge might fall through. Today, Lozovsky holds the degree of candidate in medical sciences and lives in Moscow. Everything is going well with him. Turgenev drives a trolleybus. Depressed by his month's incarceration in the sort of hole in the ground we have already described, Turgenev appeared before a military tribunal of the 36th Motorized Division. Present were Lebedev, the divisional political commissar, and Slesarev, the chief of the political branch. The witness Lozovsky was not even summoned to testify. However, after the trial, to document the false testimony, they got Lozovsky's signature and that of political commissar Seryegin. The questions the tribunal asked were, did you have a conversation with Lozovsky? What did he ask you about? What were your answers? Naively, Turgenev told them. He still couldn't understand what he was guilty of. After all, many people talk like that, he innocently exclaimed. The tribunal was interested. Who? Give us their names. But Turgenev was not of their breed. He had the last word. I beg the court to give me an assignment that will mean my death, so as to assure itself once more of my patriotism. And like a simple-hearted warrior of old, me and the person who slandered me, both of us together. Oh, no. Our job is to kill off all those chivalrous sentiments in the people. Lozovsky's duty was to hand out pills, and Seryegin's duty was to indoctrinate the soldiers. Viktor Andreevich Seryegin lives in Moscow today and works in a consumer service combine attached to the Moscow Soviet. He lives well. Whether or not you died wasn't important. What was important was that we were on our guard. The members of the military tribunal went out, had a smoke, and returned. 10 years plus 3 years disenfranchisement. There were certainly more than 10 such cases in every division during the war. Otherwise, the military tribunals would not have justified the cost of maintaining them. And how many divisions were there in all? Let the reader count them up himself. The sessions of the military tribunals were depressingly like one another. The judges were depressingly faceless and emotionless, rubber stamps. The sentences all came off the same assembly line. Everyone maintained a serious mien, but everyone understood it was a farce, above all the boys of the convoy, who were the simplest sort of fellows. At the Novosibirsk transit prison in 1945, they greeted the prisoners with a roll call based on cases. So-and-so, Article 58, 1A, 25 years. The chief of the convoy guard was curious. What did you get it for? For nothing at all. You're lying. The sentence for nothing at all is 10 years. When the military tribunals were under pressure, their sessions lasted 1 minute, the time it took them to go out and come in again. When their working day went on for 16 consecutive hours, one could see, through the door of the conference room, bowls of fruit on a table set with a white tablecloth. If they weren't in a hurry, they enjoyed delivering their sentence with a psychological twist. Sentenced to the supreme measure of punishment, and then a pause. The judges would look the condemned man in the eye. It was interesting to see how he took it. What was he feeling at that moment? Only then would the verdict continue. But taking into consideration the sincere repentance. On the walls of the waiting room, messages had been scratched with nails and scrawled in pencil. I got execution. I got 25. I got a tenner.
This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1, Section 2, continued. Cassette 1, Side 2.
On the walls of the waiting room, messages had been scratched with nails and scrawled in pencil. I got execution. I got 25. I got a tenner. They didn't clean off these graffiti. They served an educational purpose. Be scared. Bow down. Don't think that you can change anything by your behavior. Even if you were to speak in your own defense with the eloquence of Demosthenes, in a hall empty except for a handful of interrogators, like Olga Slyudsberg in 1936 at the Supreme Court, it would not help you in the slightest. All you could do would be to increase your sentence from 10 years to execution. For instance, if you were to shout, You are fascists! I am ashamed to have been a member of your party for several years. Nikolai Semyonovich Daskal did it in 1937 at the Special Collegium of the Azov Black Sea province at Maikop, presided over by Cholik. In that situation, what they did was fabricate a new case and do you in once and for all. Chavdarov has described an incident in which the accused suddenly repudiated at their trial all the false testimony they had given during their interrogation. And what happened? If there was any hesitation while glances were exchanged, it lasted no more than a few seconds. The prosecutor asked for a recess without explaining why. The interrogators and their tough boy helpers dashed in from the interrogation prison. All the prisoners, distributed among separate boxes, were given a good beating all over again and promised another after the next recess. The recess came to an end. Once again the judges questioned all of them, and this time they all confessed. Alexander Grigorievich Karetnikov, the director of the Textile Research Institute, provided an example of outstanding astuteness. Just before the session of the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court was to begin, he sent word through the guard that he wanted to give supplementary testimony. This, of course, provoked curiosity. He was received by the prosecutor. Karetnikov displayed his infected collarbone, broken by the interrogator who had struck him with a stool, and declared, "I signed everything under torture." By this time the prosecutor was cursing himself for having been so greedy to get supplementary testimony. But it was too late. Each of them is fearless only as long as he is an anonymous cog in the whole machine. But just as soon as the responsibility has become personalized, individualized, concentrated on him, just as soon as the searchlight is on him, he grows pale and realizes that he is nothing and can slip on any chance banana peel. So Karetnikov caught the prosecutor, and the latter was unwilling to suppress the whole business. The session of the Military Collegium began, and Karetnikov repeated his statement in front of them. Now there was a case in which the Military Collegium went out and rarely conferred. But the only verdict they could have brought in was acquittal, which would have meant releasing Karetnikov on the spot. Therefore, they brought in no verdict at all. As if nothing at all had happened, they took Karetnikov back to prison, treated his collarbone, and kept him another 3 months. A very polite new interrogator entered the case, who wrote out a new warrant for Karetnikov's arrest. If the Collegium had not twisted things, he might at least have spent those 3 months as a free man. The interrogator asked the same questions as the first interrogator. Karetnikov, sensing freedom in the offing, conducted himself staunchly and refused to admit any guilt whatsoever. And what happened next? He got 8 years from an OSO. This example shows well enough the possibilities available to the prisoner and the possibilities available to the OSO. It was the poet Derzhavin who wrote, "A partial court is worse than banditry. Judges are enemies, there sleeps the law. In front of you the citizen's neck lies stretched out, quiet and without defense." But it was a rare thing for such accidents to take place in the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court. For that matter, it was in general rare for it to rub clear its clouded eyes and take a look at any individual little tin soldier of a prisoner. In 1937, ADR, an electrical engineer, was taken up to the 4th floor, running upstairs with a convoy guard on either side of him. In all probability, the elevator was working, but there were so many prisoners pouring in and out that the officials and employees would not have been able to use the elevator if the prisoners had been permitted to. Meeting a convicted prisoner who had just left, they dashed into the court. The Military Collegium was in such a hurry they hadn't sat down yet, and all 3 members remained standing. Catching his breath with difficulty, for he had been weakened by his long interrogation, R. blurted out his full name. They muttered something, exchanged glances, and Ulrich, the very same, no less, proclaimed, 20 years! And they dragged R. out at a gallop, and at a gallop dragged in the next prisoner. It was all like a dream. In February 1963, I, too, got to climb those stairs, but I was courteously accompanied by a colonel, who was also a Communist Party organizer. And in that room with the circular colonnade, in which, they say, the plenary sessions of the Supreme Court of the USSR meet, with an enormous horseshoe-like table that had another round table inside it and 7 antique chairs. 70 officials of the military collegium heard me out, that same military collegium which once sentenced Karetnikov and R. and others, and so on and so forth. And I said to them, "What a remarkable day this is! Although I was first sentenced to camp and then to eternal exile, I never before saw a single judge face to face, and now I see all of you assembled here together."
And they, rubbing their eyes open, for the first time saw a living Zek. But it turned out that it had not been they. Yes, they said it had not been they. They assured me that those others were no longer present. Some had retired honorably on pensions. A few had been removed. Ulrich, the outstanding executioner of all, had been removed, it turned out, back in Stalin's time in 1950, for, believe it or not, leniency. Some of them, there were only a few of these, had even been tried under Khrushchev, and in their role as defendants, they had threatened, "Today you are trying us, tomorrow we will try you. Watch out." But like all the starts made under Khrushchev, this effort, too, which had been very active at first, was soon abandoned. He dropped it before it got far enough to produce an irreversible change, which meant that things were left where they had been. On that occasion, several veterans of the bench, all speaking up at the same time, gave voice to their recollections, unwittingly providing me with material for this chapter. Oh, if only they had undertaken to remember and to publish. But the years pass, another 5 have gone by, and it has not become any brighter or lighter. They recalled how certain judges, at conferences of their judicial colleagues, took pride when they spoke from the rostrum of having succeeded in not applying Article 51 of the Criminal Code, which specifies those circumstances that extenuate guilt, and thus had succeeded in handing down sentences of 25 years instead of 10, and how the courts had been humiliatingly subservient to the organs. A certain judge was trying a case. A Soviet citizen who had returned from the United States had made the slanderous statement that there were good automobile roads in America, and nothing else. That was all there was to the case. The judge ventured to send the case back for further investigation for the purpose of getting genuine anti-Soviet materials. In other words, so that the accused could be beaten and tortured. But his praiseworthy intention wasn't taken into account. The angry answer came back, "You mean you don't trust our organs?" And in the upshot, the judge was exiled to the post of secretary of a military tribunal on Sakhalin. Under Khrushchev, reproof was not so severe. Judges who made mistakes were sent, where do you think? To work as lawyers. Izvestia, June the 9th, 1964. This throws an interesting light on views of legal defense. In 1918, V.I. Lenin demanded that judges who handed down sentences that were too lenient be excluded from the party. The prosecutor's office was just as subservient to the organs. When in 1942 Ryumin's flagrant abuses in the counterintelligence section of the Northern Fleet became known, the prosecutor's office did not dare interfere on its own, but only reported respectfully to Abakumov that his boys were acting up. Abakumov had good reason to consider the organs the salt of the earth. This was the occasion when he called in Ryumin and promoted him, to his own eventual undoing. There just wasn't enough time that February day, or they would have told me 10 times as much as they did. But this, too, provides food for thought. If both the courts and the prosecutor's office were simply pawns of the Minister of State Security, then maybe there isn't any need for a separate chapter to describe them. They vied with each other in telling me things, and I kept looking around me in astonishment. They were people, real people. They were smiling. They were explaining that their intentions were of the best. Well, and what if things turn full circle, and it is once again up to them to try me? Maybe even in that very hall. And they were showing me the main hall. Well, so they will convict me. Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? The people or the system? For several centuries we had a proverb, "Don't fear the law, fear the judge." But in my opinion the law has outstripped people, and people have lagged behind in cruelty. It is time to reverse the proverb. Don't fear the judge, fear the law. Abakumov's kind of law, of course.
They stepped onto the rostrum and talked about Ivan Denisovich. They said happily that the book had eased their consciences. That's what they said. They admitted that the picture I painted was decidedly on the bright side, that every one of them knew of camps worse than that. Ah, so they did know. Of the 70 people seated around that horseshoe, several turned out to be knowledgeable in literature, even to be readers of Novi Mir. They were eager for reform. They spoke forcefully about our social ulcers, about our neglect of our rural areas. And I sat there and thought, if the first tiny droplet of truth has exploded like a psychological bomb, what then will happen in our country when whole waterfalls of truth burst forth? And they will burst forth. It has to happen. Chapter 8. The Law as a Child. We forget everything. What we remember is not what actually happened, not history, but merely that hackneyed, dotted line they have chosen to drive into our memories by incessant hammering. I do not know whether this is a trait common to all mankind, but it is certainly a trait of our people, and it is a vexing one. It may have its source in goodness, but it is vexing nonetheless. It makes us an easy prey for liars. Therefore, if they demand that we forget even the public trials, we forget them. The proceedings were open and were reported in our newspapers, but they didn't drill a hole in our brains to make us remember, and so we've forgotten them. Only things repeated on the radio day after day drill holes in the brain. I am not even talking about young people, since they, of course, know nothing of all this, but about people who were alive at the time of those trials. Ask any middle-aged person to enumerate the highly publicized open trials. He will remember those of Bukharin and Zinoviev, and knitting his brow, that of the Promparty, too. And that's all. There were no other public trials. Yet, in actual fact, they began right after the October Revolution. In 1918, quantities of them were taking place in many different tribunals. They were taking place before there were either laws or codes, when the judges had to be guided solely by the requirements of the revolutionary workers' and peasants' power. At the same time, they were regarded as blazing their own trail of bold legality. Their detailed history will some day be written by someone, and it's not for us even to attempt to include it in our present investigation. However, we cannot do without a brief review. It is our duty, anyway, to probe some of the charred ruins which go all the way back to that gentle, misty, rose-colored dawn. In those dynamic years, the sabres of war were not rusting in their scabbards, nor did the executioners' revolvers have time to grow cold in their holsters. Only later on did the custom develop of hiding executions in cellars under cover of night, and of shooting the victims in the back of the head. In 1918, the famous Ryazan-Chekist Stelmach had those sentenced to death shot in the courtyard during the day, so that prisoners awaiting execution could watch from the prison windows. There was an official term, current then, extrajudicial reprisal, not because there weren't any courts at the time, but because there was the Cheka. This fledgling, whose beak had not yet hardened, was warmed and encouraged by Trotsky. Terror is a powerful means of policy, and one would have to be a hypocrite not to understand this. And Zinoviev rejoiced, too, not yet foreseeing his own end. The letters GPU, like the letters VCHK, are the most popular in the world. Because it was more efficient. Certainly there were courts, and they tried and convicted and executed people, but we need to remember that parallel to them, and independently of them, extrajudicial reprisal went on at the same time. How can one depict its scale? M. Latsis, in his popular review of the Cheka's activity, gives us material for only a year and a half, 1918 and half of 1919, and for only 20 provinces of central Russia. The figures presented here are far from complete, in part, perhaps, out of modesty. Those shot by the Cheka, that is without trial, bypassing the courts, numbered 8,389 persons. 8,389. Counter-revolutionary organizations uncovered 412, a fantastic figure in view of our inadequate capacity for organization throughout our history, and also the general isolation of individuals in those years, and the general psychological depression. The total of those arrested, 87,000, and this figure smells of understatement. What comparison is available for purposes of evaluation? In 1907, a group of leftist leaders published a collection of essays entitled Against Capital Punishment, in which are listed by name all those sentenced to death in Tsarist Russia from 1826 to 1906. The editors qualify their findings with the statement that there were some additional victims whose names remain unknown, and that the list is incomplete. However, it is certainly not so incomplete as Latzis' materials compiled during the Civil War. The list totals 1,397, from which 233 persons have to be deducted because their death sentences were commuted, as do an additional 270 who were sentenced in absentia and never caught, for the most part Polish rebels who had fled to the west. That leaves 894, a figure covering 80 years, which is not even close to Latzis' total for only 1.5 years, and not including all the provinces of Russia either. True, the editors of the collection cite another presumed statistic of 1,310 for those sentenced to death, although perhaps not executed, in 1906 alone, and a total of 3,419 for 1826 through 1906. But this, mind you, was right in the midst of the notorious Stolypin reaction, a period for which an additional figure is available, 950 executions over a period of 6 months. In fact, the Stolypin military field tribunals were in existence for 6 months, all told. It sounds awful, and yet it does not make much of an impression on our hardened nerves, even if we multiply by 3 this figure of 950 for 6 months, in order to compare it with the Latzis figure for 18 months in the post-revolutionary period. We still come up with the fact that the terror after the revolution was at least 3 times more intense than Stolypin's. And that was for just 20 provinces, and excluded courts and tribunals. And from November 1917 on, the courts acted on their own, despite all the difficulties at the time. Guiding principles of the criminal law of the RSFSR were issued for their use in 1919. We have not read this work, could not obtain it, and know only that it included imprisonment for an indefinite term, in other words, pending a special order. The courts were of 3 kinds, the People's Courts, the Circuit Courts, and the Revolutionary Tribunals, the Rev Tribunals. The People's Courts handled ordinary misdemeanors and non-political criminal cases. They were not empowered to impose death sentences, and, laughable as it seems, the People's Court could not, in fact, impose sentences exceeding 2 years. Up to July 1918, the heritage of the left SRs still endured in our judicial proceedings. Only by special intervention of the government, and only individually, were impermissibly lenient sentences raised to 20 years. From July 1918 on, the People's Courts were given the right to hand down sentences of up to 5 years, and in 1922, when all threats of war had died down, the People's Courts got the right to impose sentences of up to 10 years, and lost the right to sentence anyone to less than 6 months. From the beginning, the Circuit Courts and the Rev Tribunals had the power to impose the death sentence, but they lost it for a brief period, the Circuit Courts in 1920 and the Rev Tribunals in 1921. There were many tiny ups and downs in this period, which only a historian pursuing all the details of those years would be able to trace. Perhaps that historian will seek out the documents and unroll for us the scroll of tribunal sentences, and also the statistics, though probably not. Whatever time and events failed to destroy was destroyed by persons interested in having such material disappear. We know only that the Rev Tribunals were not asleep.